Good afternoon. It's 4:30, and I call this meeting to order. We will begin tonight's meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. That's weird, it cut off. Okay, I apologize. So we will begin tonight's meeting with the elected school board trustees' oath of office. I would now like to introduce Interim Superintendent Rick Schmidt, who will swear in the new trustees.
Thank you, Trustee Rawlings. I will begin with Allison Emery. If you'll stand up, please. So if you'll just follow along, I'll prompt. Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. That I will every time I do this, I mess that part up. And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter. Congratulations. Okay, Trustee Laura Ciosi. I state your name.
I, Laura Ciosi,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
that I will well and faithfully
that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I'm about to enter.
upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
And I'm going to go briefly off script. If your families want to take a picture or two before we move forward with the meeting, we can do that. So we'll take like a 3-minute break for pictures, okay? We'll move on with the agenda. We're at item 1.3, the Brown Act training. I now welcome Mr. Brzee of AALRR, who will facilitate our Brown Act training.
Good evening. Congratulations to the new members. My name is Mark Brzee. I've been a school attorney for 30 years in California, representing districts in general counsel and a variety of things. Here to do an overview of the Brown Act, and I want to emphasize overview. I've done all-day trainings on this subject before, and that's easy to fill up the time to do that. So I have a presentation. I'm going to try to leave time for questions at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand and ask it, but there's a fairly good chance that I might be getting to it at a later slide. So next slide, or on to the first slide. Intent of the Brown Act. It's written in the government code, and it's a broadly stated intent that public agencies should take their actions openly and deliberations should be conducted openly, and that the people of the state don't yield their sovereignty to the people and the agencies which serve them. So the general requirement is openness. Another statement is in the case of Boyle versus City of Redondo Beach. It's also designed to facilitate public participation, to make it the public more interested in participating because they get more information about what is being considered and what is being done, and to curb the misuse of the democratic process by preventing secrecy. I'll talk about briefly, there are circumstances where you can have things in closed session, as you all know, but they're narrow and they're interpreted narrowly. The general rule is openness. I don't have slides. One of the topics I don't cover in a brief overview is enforcement of the Brown Act. But I always like to point out, first of all, it's difficult. There's a reason that it can be an all-day training. There's a reason that the state attorney general's document on the Brown Act runs 75, 80 pages, I think. There's a lot of law surrounding it. It's difficult. And compliance is not always easy either. It's kind of surprising to me sometimes. You think about, I've been doing this 30 years. I typically get a question about the Brown Act once a week or more. And there are a lot of people in every school district, from the superintendent to the superintendent's assistant to the board members to the departments who are submitting items for the agenda. There's a lot of attention to the Brown Act, but questions come up all the time, so it's difficult. And I think I like to point out that the legislature recognizes that, as I see it, in a number of ways. First of all, you can't be sued for a violation of the Brown Act unless you get a written notice of either a demand to cure or correct an action that was taken allegedly in violation of the Brown Act, or to cease and desist practices that your board is engaged in that violate the Brown Act. So there's always, it didn't used to be that way until a few years back. It was only the action taken lawsuit that required a demand letter. Now any lawsuit requires a demand letter, and there's always a chance to correct a violation if you found a violation. And I think that is a legislative recognition that this is not an easy thing. The compliance is not always easy. The legislature also recognizes it in the fact that a Brown Act violation or a Brown Act lawsuit won't result in a finding against the district or city or whatever it is if there was substantial compliance with the Brown Act. So that is a provision that's written right into the law. And then the courts have recognized it too, in that if an action is taken in violation of the Brown Act, that action is not nullified unless there was prejudice or harm to the community or the person filing the lawsuit. There was a recent lawsuit I represented Poway Unified on, and that's what it came down to. Sorry about the reference to Poway. I understand the chuckling now. But it came down to substantial compliance and the issue of prejudice. And the judge said to the plaintiff, there was no prejudice. You knew about this the whole time. The public knew about it. It was a technical violation, so you don't win. And I'm often asked, who is it that gets sued? One of the issues in that case was the suit was against the board, the district, and 3 individual board members. And the 3 individual board members were out of the lawsuit. The court ruled you can only file a lawsuit against a board. So it is the board collectively that is responsible for compliance. But compliance can only happen if all 5, in this case 5 individuals, comply with the Brown Act. But an individual who violates the Brown Act can put the entire district and the board on the hook. And the consequences can be severe. An action can be nullified. There are political ramifications for it. I think perhaps the biggest consequence is the attorney fee provisions in the Brown Act. If you receive a demand letter, you disagree with it, and litigation is initiated. If the district loses, you have to pay the attorney fees of the other side, which can be substantial. So compliance is important. I also always, or don't pass up the opportunity to give a quick little editorial I wrote when I was a young attorney with a full head of hair, where I suggested in the mid-90s, when the legislature was considering expanding the Brown Act and putting more restrictions on local agencies, I said to the state legislature, why don't you do the same thing to yourself? Why don't you have to comply with the open meeting requirements? Because they don't. Everything in Sacramento happens in secret. They come out to the Assembly or Senate floor and vote, but it's already been decided behind closed doors most of the time. Didn't get a good reaction to that, but I think that's a certain level of unfairness, I think, that is associated with that. Now, on these quick presentations, the way I years ago decided to try to approach it is to say the Brown Act in a sentence, and that's what's up on the screen. It's all meetings of a legislative body must be properly noticed, open and public unless a closed session is specifically authorized, provide for public participation, and address only items on the publicly posted agenda. Now, there's a series of slides that are not in your handout here, but if you just click through them, Rob, so we have topics within there: meeting, legislative body, proper notice, open unless a closed session is authorized, public participation, and address only items that are on the agenda. And so that's the breakdown of topics that I will go through now. The first is a legislative body. What's a legislative body? It's defined by the Brown Act. It is the board, and in Carlsbad Unified and other districts, the person that have a personnel commission, it also applies to the personnel commission. It also applies to commissions, committees, or other bodies that the board creates by board action. The superintendent's cabinet is not subject to the Brown Act because that's administratively created. The board didn't create that. But if a board takes action to create a committee, then it is subject to the Brown Act. There's a narrow exception to that, and that is if the board creates a committee composed solely of less than a majority of the board. So a committee of 2 with no other members, and it's advisory and it's ad hoc. You see that sometimes, current events, sometimes you see that with a superintendent search, or when there's a vacancy on the board where a committee will be created for 2 board members to look at all the applications for people to fill the vacancy and come back with a recommendation. As long as it's only the 2 board members and it's temporary and it's advisory, that committee would be exempt from the Brown Act, but any other body that is created by the board or by state law applies. So that's legislative bodies. That's pretty straightforward. That's almost never an issue. Meetings is what usually is the issue. And meetings are, for years, were not, the word meeting was not defined in the Brown Act. You hear about serial meetings. I'll talk more about that later. That was a product of court decisions that concluded that when it says all meetings must be open, a meeting includes a series of phone calls that a president of the board or a superintendent makes to develop a collective concurrence on an action to be taken. But it's defined in the law now. It's a gathering of a majority to hear, discuss, deliberate, or act on a matter within the board's or the Personnel Commission's subject matter jurisdiction. It's gathering a majority in one place. It's this right here, what we're talking about. That's clear that it's a meeting. It's also defined in the law as a series of communications of any kind involving a majority to discuss, deliberate, or act on a matter within the board's jurisdiction. I put in red highlight and italicized there those words because you notice the word here is not in the definition of a series of communications. So a series of communications where board members hear the same thing is not a violation of the Brown Act, and that was done deliberately. And these provisions of the Brown Act were put in by the legislature after a court decision where the Court of Appeal concluded that a board had not violated the Brown Act because there were a series of communications, but they didn't actually make a decision. And the legislature didn't like that. They focused on the fact that there was a series of communications, they were deliberating, and the fact that they didn't take a final vote or decide what to do was enough. So a serial meeting, and I alluded to it, it's defined in, no, not Siri, serial meeting. I see. A majority of members outside of a meeting use a series of communications of any kind to discuss, deliberate, or take action. And like I said, that was added to the Brown Act after that appellate court decision. Individual conversations between a staff member and a board or commission member are not prohibited as long as the staff member does not convey the position of any other member. So the superintendent can have a conversation with individual board members one at a time to provide information and answer questions as long as there is no conveying of what any of the rest of you said, whether it's a position or not. This can be a dangerous situation in a number of ways. You can't take action on it. You can't do it for the purpose of counting votes, basically. A superintendent or any other staff member or a member of the governing board, which is different when it's a board member, but under this exception, if an individual staff member contacts each board member and gets a determination of how they feel about something, then that's a good old-fashioned series of communications to develop a collective concurrence. But providing information and answering questions is enough, is permitted. A question that I'm also often asked is, what about a board member simply providing information to the other four board members? The Brown Act doesn't address that directly. It's clear that one board member can provide information to another board member, and the two of them can talk about all they want about it as long as it doesn't involve a third member, because it has to involve a majority. But in that circumstance, my advice is always to have the superintendent be the source of providing information to the board. So I always recommend that if a board member would like information to distribute it to the rest of the board, you send it to the superintendent, and then the superintendent says, could say, I've been asked to distribute this by a board member. I advise against identifying which board member, especially if it's something that's an advocacy position, because that is conveying the position of another member. But that, I think, is the safest way to avoid the serial communication problems. The definition of deliberate is interpreted broadly under the Brown Act. It includes the collective acquisition and exchange of facts we see at board meetings, or you think about a jury in court. You hear all this information, you get all the evidence, and then you go in to deliberate. And that's where you discuss how should we vote, guilty, not guilty, etc. And you see that in a board meeting. Motion, second, now let's discuss. And that kind of fits into the category of deliberations. But 3 board members exchanging a bunch of information with one another outside of a meeting for consideration about something is part of deliberations. So that is another difficulty of this. And again, staff simply providing information to everybody is not. Board members collectively doing it creates problems. And an action taken means any collective decision. You often think, I've heard it before, well, it can't be a Brown Act violation because we didn't vote. We didn't actually do a motion and a second and a vote. I'm in closed session all the time, like giving an update on litigation and getting authorization to settle, for example. I don't need a motion and a second and a vote. If I see 5 heads nodding up and down, that's enough, and that's action. That's a collective concurrence, whether it's thumbs up, heads nodding, and things like that. But it's not just a motion or a second. It's any decision to move forward on something. So to emphasize these issues with meetings, I have a series of these slides with graphics. I alluded to this before. An email discussion or any other kind of interaction between board member 1 and board member 2 does not create Brown Act issues, even if it's a topic within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. I personally think it's easy for me to say, but board member number 2 in this circumstance, if that board member didn't invite the interaction and the discussion, now that individual board member is precluded from talking to the one other board member that they would like to talk to. So that can create some issues, and I've seen that before. But it's not a Brown Act issue if it only involves 2 board members. If you involve a third one, even if board member number 1 is not involved in the communication between 2 and 3. It's a series of communications, and if there's a discussion on the topic and it's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board, it violates the Brown Act. And there's no provision that says it's only if the item is on an upcoming agenda that it's a violation. It's any topic within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Next slide. This is what I alluded to before. Back and forth questions and information between individual board members and a staff member is fine as long as the member does not communicate comments or positions of other members. The bane of my existence in one of the jobs that I had, I was general counsel for San Diego Unified School District for 2 years, from 2008 to 2010. Before I escaped. But it's different now. I love that school district, but I had 2 board members who I actually asked IT if there is a way to program Outlook so you can't hit reply to all. And then I went to sending out emails to myself and blind CCing everyone, and these 2 board members figured that out really quick, just hit reply and then added the other board members. But that's a violation of the Brown Act. And so when you get that information, and it can be sent out to all of you at the same time by a staff member, via email, but no reply to all, because then that creates a Brown Act violation. Then we have technology challenges, and there are different technology challenges all the time. For a long time, there was a question about social media use. And is it a violation of the Brown Act for two board members to click like on a Facebook post of a third board member? I always felt the answer was yes, because like or dislike or whatever denotes a point of view. The legislature addressed this in 2020, and they adopted a rule that's even stricter than for other forms of communication. They made it clear that you are allowed to have a Facebook or Instagram or social media account in your capacity as a board member, or a personal account where you post things about your role as a board member. That's allowed. That would present, I think, some First Amendment problems if it wasn't allowed. And it can be to answer questions, provide information to the public, or to ask for input from the public on a particular matter. Please comment if you have a point of view on this. That's one of the things that you do as an elected official, is you want feedback from your constituents. Except, going to the next slide, the same as the rule against serial communications, a majority may not discuss amongst themselves business of a specific nature, and that encompasses comments, the use of digital icons that express reactions, communications posted or shared on social media between members of the legislative body, so sharing a Facebook post. I'm probably dating myself by saying Facebook. I know young people don't use it anymore. Responses to the same communication on social media, again, like buttons, emojis, and things like that. And then it also says members also may not directly respond to social media communication made or posted and shared by any other member of the same legislative body. So if you use the same graphic that I did before, this, I think, is not okay times two. You have a board member number one posting on Facebook, board member number two commenting on it. It's only two board members, but under this legislation, that's a violation of the Brown Act. And I think I assume that it's a product of an assumption that board members 3, 4, or 5 are going to see that. And then it becomes part of the deliberative process where you're seeing that opinion. Whereas a private email conversation, communication, or a private conversation between two is not kind of automatically shared with the third. And then if the board member number 3 likes board member number 2's comment, that would be a separate violation. So I've heard it said before, you know what the best thing to do is? Just don't use social media as a board member. I'm not one who goes that far, but you have to be very careful. I was asked before, does that mean we shouldn't be friends on Facebook? And the answer is no. You can comment and like all you want, the vacation pictures, the celebratory things about family, recipes, whatever it is. That's outside of the subject matter jurisdiction. But if you see a social media post from a fellow board member that addresses a matter within subject matter jurisdiction, you can read it, but don't like it, don't comment on it, none of that, okay? Remote and teleconference meetings. I'll go through this quickly because this is becoming less and less prevalent. This says there are currently 2 options. There's actually 3 potential options, but the third option, it's actually back in the law, where if the governor declares a state of emergency, you can have remote meetings. Hopefully we never get to that point again. And so it's really not an option that you have on your own as a board. You have only 2. One is the traditional rules under the Brown Act, and the other is AB 2449, and unless it's extended, that only applies until January 1, 2026. I will tell you at the top that my recommendation is always just use the traditional pre-COVID teleconferencing rules. And that's what this is. You have to have a teleconference location or locations identified in the agenda that member Rawlings is going to be here. Member Emery is going to be here, and you have to have that address. It has to be a place accessible to the public. It has to allow members of the public to comment at each teleconference location. All votes in that case have to be roll call votes. You can't just do ayes and nays. And at least a quorum of the members of the board must participate from within the boundaries of the school district. I've had a board member participate in a meeting from Australia. Had family in Australia, opened the front door of the house of the family, posted a notice. Anybody who wanted to come in could come in. That happens. CSBA conferences, other conferences, vacation, but you want to, as long as reasonable measures are taken to get the agenda posted, prop open the hotel room door, because the agenda will say this board member is going to be at the Hilton in Lake Tahoe or wherever it is. So it gives that notice that you're allowed to do that. So that's what I call the old-fashioned teleconferencing authorization. The AB 2449, the reason why I think this is problematic, mainly for staff, is that it basically says board members for just cause or in emergency circumstances can attend a meeting remotely. And it doesn't have to be a location open to the public. It can be by Zoom in your dining room. But it can be announced right up until the beginning of the meeting. And if a board member participates by Zoom in that way, then everybody needs to be able to participate by Zoom and publicly comment by Zoom. So leaving this option open means that the agenda and staff and everything needs to be set up to quickly make it into a Zoom meeting when it wasn't intended to be a Zoom meeting. Now, the board has the authority to, for example, adopt a bylaw that you have to give at least 72 hours notice of this, or 96 hours notice of this if you want to attend under AB 2449. But you don't always know childcare needs, illness, emergency circumstances. You don't always know that. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this is not an incredibly viable option. And I'm going to just point out, without going through these, that there are procedural requirements associated with this, and there are some limitations in the law. That's the next slide that you can look at if you're curious for it. And again, it's only through January 1, 2026. I suspect it will be extended, that sunset date will be taken off, and it will become an authorization because the technology is there now to make it easier. But you heard me on my point of view on the staff issue and in a lot of ways the public notice issue, that a member of the public shouldn't learn 2 hours before a meeting that they can attend by Zoom. Because one board member has said, I have an emergency circumstance and I need to attend by Zoom. So properly noticed. In going through that sentence, that's the next one, properly noticed. Regular meeting, the notice has to be 72 hours prior to the start of the meeting. Special meeting has to be 24 hours. There are fairly recently enacted website posting requirements, and you have to have downloadable and searchable documents within that. The agenda, and I should also say in conjunction with that something that is often misunderstood is the agenda. Think of the pre-fax machine, pre-cell phone days, all of that technology days, where the agenda was 2 or 3 or 4 sheets of paper posted in a kiosk at a variety of locations. That's still the requirement. That's the agenda posting requirement. It has to be on your website, but It doesn't have to, there's no requirement that all of the backup materials have to be posted also. There's no requirement that says backup materials can't be modified or changed. There are times when a presentation staff is going to be doing is not done until 3 hours before the meeting, but you post a draft with the agenda 72 hours before. The requirement is that any document that the board is given or given access to within 72 hours of the meeting has to be made available to the public immediately on demand. And the agenda has to give an address of where they could get that, where they can get that. That's one of the reasons why, in addition to just a general principle of being transparent, that on platforms like Board Docs, which you use, they're just automatically posted. People don't need to ask for them. People don't need to come to the district office to get them. There were districts playing games that, something would be distributed to board members 48 hours before a meeting, and somebody would say, I want a copy of that, and they say, well, that's a public records request. Go ahead and fill that out, and we have 10 days to respond to it. Not a good practice in a variety of ways. And so the legislature stepped in and said, if the board gets it within 72 hours of the meeting, it has to be made available to everybody at the same time the board receives it. Technology has made that pretty easy. The agenda must contain a brief general description of each item of business, and the Brown Act specifically says a brief general description of an item generally need not exceed 20 words. So that's another aspect of it. Board Docs, you see the agenda item listed, but then if you click on that, you get to the whole background, fiscal impact, all of that information. None of that is required by the Brown Act to be posted in advance. But for transparency, it's good to do that, and it's easy to do that. But the requirement is a brief general description that need not exceed 20 words. Next slide. Amending an agenda inside of 72 hours or 24 hours for a special meeting is generally not permitted unless it is to pull the item or make non-substantive corrections. I litigated to the Court of Appeal several years ago for Grossmont High School District. The board was considering amending a number of board policies. And the agenda listed all of the board policies that were being considered for amendment. It was a controversial issue. It will tell you it was not very recent that the amendments were to modify board policies regarding employees and students to address the issue of actual perceived sexual orientation. The student board member noticed that there was one other policy that should be listed and should be amended and have that inserted. So inside of 72 hours of the meeting, they added that to the agenda. It was like board policy blank, 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 and then they added one more within 72 hours. Court of Appeal said that was a violation of the Brown Act. The district didn't win because of the prejudice issue, and at the time, the law was the cease and desist law, because they didn't take action at that meeting. There was a first reading. But the cease and desist body of law was different, but it was still expensive litigation. The agenda must reasonably apprise the public of the matters to be considered in sufficient detail to allow the public to determine whether to participate at the meeting. So that's my guiding principle, is somebody reading this brief general description that need not exceed 20 words going to know what the board is considering? And if the answer to that is yes, then it meets the requirement. A good case on that is Carlson versus Paradise Unified School District, going way back to 1971. The agenda said continuation school site change. So What the board actually did is they moved the continuation school to a new site, the site of an elementary school that they also voted to close at the same time. That was hiding the ball from the public. The real action included closing an elementary school, which I don't know if you've ever been to a board meeting where that's being considered, but that creates a lot of interest. The only school board meeting I went to when I was in high school was when I was a freshman, and they were considering closing my high school. It was a big enough deal for me to go to a board meeting. So this, that is when you're talking about a brief general description. Another difficulty or trap is every board, and consistent with the Brown Act, every board agenda I see, except for some special meetings, has board member reports, where you report on your activities, and that's written into the Brown Act. You can do that, briefly report on your activities. I've seen it before where, a board member said, I visited this and I really liked it, and they were talking about blah, blah, blah. And so I'd like to make a motion that we do something in second, and then they launch off into a discussion and take action. The public didn't have notice of that. Another one that I found is usually the last item on an agenda is future agenda items, where a board member says, I would like to place a certain item on the agenda of our next meeting, and then the board ends up discussing that issue for 10 minutes. It wasn't on the agenda. You can't discuss it. Some boards do that. The various board bylaws have different processes that the board agrees to through its bylaws for placement of items on the agenda by board members, and so that's one of them. But that's an area to be careful of. A very generally described agenda item that launches into a meeting. Okay, closed sessions. I mentioned at the beginning that these are construed narrowly. The general rule is openness. This is a confidential topic is not necessarily enough for a closed session. It has to fit into a specific authorization. There are many of them. They're all narrowly construed. The next couple of slides goes through the entire list on of closed session authorizations. Go back to the one before. On this one, it lists the 4 public employee provisions, which is Government Code Section 54957, which is appointment, employment, performance evaluation, and discipline dismissal or release. That one is very common. That's the only closed session authorization in the Brown Act that is designed to protect the interest of someone or something other than the district. It's there to protect the reputational interest of the employee. And so if you're not talking about a specific employee or the performance of an employee or whether to hire an employee, it's an open session item. I've seen it before. Closed session item on the reorganization of the Educational Services Department. That's an open session item. Unless for some reason there is going to be a discussion of the specific performance of employees within that department. And that can create problems too, because you can't reorganize to avoid the discipline process. That's one. Conference with labor negotiators is another one. Every district that I know of puts that on their agenda, but in fact, the collective bargaining law that applies to K through 12 school districts and community college districts actually exempts from the Brown Act closed sessions of the board to discuss negotiations and give direction to their negotiators. The reason for that is sometimes you're at the negotiating table and you're this close to an agreement, and rather than say, okay, well, we need to put it on the agenda, someone on the bargaining team can contact board members. You authorize 2%, we're at 2.1, are you okay with 2.1? That's actually exempt from the Brown Act. But I think it's a good practice if you're going to be talking about labor negotiations at a regular meeting or a special meeting that's posted in advance, you might as well tell the public that you're going to be doing that, even though you don't have to. The top ones on this list: conference with legal counsel regarding pending litigation or anticipated litigation. That is one where it requires, and it's based on the opinion of legal counsel, that there is significant exposure to litigation. Litigation is an important word. Significant exposure to liability is not the standard. So significant exposure to frivolous litigation would still allow a closed session. But we want to meet with our attorney to ask our attorney some legal questions and get legal advice is not a basis for a closed session. It can be done in writing. California Supreme Court decision from the 90s confirmed that if a written legal opinion from counsel is sent to all 5 board members, that's not a meeting. If the board members then collectively meet and discuss it, that would be a meeting, and it wouldn't be authorized by the Brown Act unless there's a significant exposure to litigation. And then there's a number of reporting things that time doesn't allow me to go into detail on with that. On the next slide, there is real property negotiations is the most common one for a school district on this list of this second slide. What's not listed is, because it's not in the Brown Act or separate provisions of the Education Code, if you are considering a student discipline matter. That's actually in the Education Code because cities, counties, other legislative bodies subject to the Brown Act, they don't deal with student discipline issues. So that's a separate one for school districts. Also on closed sessions, there are still meetings. They have to be listed on the agenda. I mentioned the exception. They have to be preceded by an open session disclosing the items to be discussed, and the disclosure can be in writing or verbal, and with public comment rights before. I see this happen sometimes where the closed session is going to be in a conference room and everybody just goes into the conference room and there's no starting of the meeting. I've seen it before where, using this room as an example, if you do closed session somewhere else where a board member goes out and says there's no one there. So in that case, again, substantial compliance would apply because you checked if there was somebody who wanted to speak that they would have been able to speak. But there was no one there. But that's something that can be overlooked sometimes and skipped over. And for some actions, but not all actions taken in closed session, there are announcements that have to be made. If there's a decision by the board to settle litigation, if the board is the last accepting party and it's final, or other certain contractual actions that are final when the board takes the action, that needs to be reported out. Action to affect the status of a public employee has to be reported out, and the title of the position, but not the name of the person, has to be reported out. And those reports can be verbally or in writing also. Almost without exception, boards do it verbally, but the Brown Act explicitly says it can be in writing. And like I said before, receipt of confidential information is not a meeting. The Supreme Court they almost literally said that members of a city council don't have a meeting simply by opening their mail. So receipt of confidential information is not a closed session. And then public participation. Public must have an opportunity to address items on the agenda before or during the body's consideration of the item. boards do this differently. Some have all of the public comment at or near the beginning of the meeting. Some of them, community college districts, there's actually a separate provision of the code that requires public comment at the time each item on the agenda is taken up. That is not in the Brown Act. That's a specific provision for community colleges in the education code. So most boards, in my experience, they take public comment as each item comes up, but not all do. For regular meetings, you must allow public comment on non-agenda items, but that doesn't apply to special meetings. Some boards allow that for special meetings also. And like with public comment on agenda items, public comment on non-agenda items can be before, at the beginning of a meeting, could be at the end of a meeting, or can be both. Some districts, we're going to do 30 minutes of non-agenda item comment before, but if we have more than that, then the rest are going to go to the end. In circumstances like that, you have to make sure that you're not picking and choosing who speaks during the initial 30 minutes. You want it to be random or in the order that cards were submitted. But it is one of many examples of how the law has recognized, including in published court decisions, that the purpose of your meetings is to get business done. And if you need to have a bylaw that says 20 minutes, 30 minutes tops on non-agenda public comment, you're allowed to have that, enforce that, as long as you enforce it consistently and in a non-discriminatory fashion. I was actually at home. I got a text message the other night of two people who had been, one person had been completely disruptive at this community college district meeting. And I got a text. He's here again. He's submitted 22 cards, one on every single agenda item, and he brought somebody with him who has submitted 22 cards, one on every agenda item. Is there anything we can do? And the answer to that was, in my opinion, yes. It's a business meeting. So the board took an action to say, in order to get our business done for this meeting, we are going to limit total time for individual speakers to 10 minutes and no more than 3 minutes for any agenda item. And they enforced that, and nobody challenged it because I don't think it can be challenged. There's a case called White versus City of Norwalk that emphasized these kinds of things. So for public participation, you can have those kinds of reasonable regulations like this slide says: total time per speaker, total time per topic, and total time for non-agenda. The next slide, audio and video recording is allowed unless it prevents you from conducting your business. You can't do secret ballots. I talked about agenda backup material and materials provided within 72 hours of a meeting. That relates not only to the agenda requirement, but to public participation. And I always advise beware of the danger of the perception of silent participation. I was at a board meeting one time where it was pretty obvious that two board members were texting each other during the meeting, because it was like you'd see one board member do this and set the phone down, and then the other one would look down, pick it up, and do that. Again, two board members, it's not a violation of the Brown Act. If it was three board members, it would be, because you're deliberating. Even though you're sitting in a public meeting, you're deliberating privately on a public item. But even with two members, it's not a good look. I've said before that the Brown Act at times can be 95% political and 5% legal. If you have the perception of being, or the reputation of being a board that operates in secret, that's hard to get past. So conversations during breaks is another one. The three board members during a break, they go over and huddle. Maybe they're talking about, the NFL games on Sunday, and probably are, because I think most board members recognize this kind of thing, but it's another thing to be careful. And then the last slide, limited to items on the agenda. I've been alluding to this, and this is kind of a logical when you talk about not only having a sufficient agenda item description, but no action or discussion can be undertaken on any item unless it appears on the agenda. There are provisions that say these are specific provisions that board members can briefly respond to statements made or questions posed by persons exercising public testimony rights. Just last week, I had a board member who decided to talk for 5.5 minutes in response to a speaker who only had 3 minutes. I don't think that meets the definition of briefly. So you have to be careful with that. You also, again, it's a business meeting, it's not a town hall meeting. So one of the reasons why board members typically refrain from engaging and interacting is then it becomes a back and forth and not a public comment. Sometimes there's a direction to staff. Can you look into that? If a parent expresses a concern about something, you don't want to just ignore that, but the board can direct staff to look into it. You can ask questions for clarification, provide a reference, and again, be careful because it's easy to go beyond these and stray beyond these boundaries. So the last slide is just repeated with the 5 things. So those are the elements of the Brown Act in a sentence, and I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions. I'm sorry. I have, again, technology. I have to be available for a closed session on my phone in my car, probably starting at 5:35 or 5:40. So I can go a little bit over 5:30 if there are questions. So any questions?
Are there brief questions? Trustee Verpeff?
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to clarify, Mark, on the closed session. So when we list, for example, today, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, for closed session, do all of those items have to be discussed? Or is it okay to list certain items? You may have answered this question, but I'm just.
No, I didn't answer that question, and
Okay.
it's a good question.
Okay.
The answer is no, they don't have to be discussed. And I see it all the time. You know, you have to post the agenda 3 days before the meeting. Most districts now post it longer than 3 days before. An issue could be resolved by the time, you get into a meeting. Turns out the employee resigned, so we don't need to discuss that one. It's in the personnel action report on the consent agenda that employee resigned. So you go on to the next thing. Same thing with, I know this goes beyond your question, but for even open session, the board has the authority to reorganize things on the agenda, to move something up. There are times where you're going to have a packed room, and it's because of agenda item 6.2. It's perfectly okay if you come out of closed session, take public comment on non-agenda items, and somebody say, I make a motion that we move item 6.2 to right now. And it's okay to do that. Same thing with pulling items that are on the agenda. Staff can pull an item, the board can table an item. An agenda basically says these are the things that we might be dealing with, but you don't have to.
Other questions? I have one. Thank you very much, and I know I submitted a lot of questions in advance, and I think you covered all of them but one, so I
Okay.
appreciate that. My question is during governance requests, can the board direct staff, or a majority of the board direct staff to take an action that is within that staff's discretion, absent the board? So if the board says, hey, I want you to post this item on the website, and there's a majority that says, post that item on the website, is that within the Brown Act under governance requests?
I say to people that all the time that in 3 years of law school, you learn more than how to say it depends, and I'll get back to you. But that's an it depends question. When you say governance, my question back would be, what was the agenda item? Did the public have notice that?
They would be under an item called governance requests. So like on our agenda, we have a section that says governance requests. And so it's not discussed, but it would be, let's say, a majority of the board says, we want you to do X to staff. And if 3 folks say, yes, we want you to do that, but the staff member could have done it regardless whether the board directed them to do it or not.
I think there you're probably, first of all, I would say governance requests. I'm a member of the public and I look at the agenda and it says governance requests. Do I know what that means? Is that enough? That's question number one. Something like what I started the meeting talking about of the legislature recognizes this is difficult, substantial compliance, prejudice. If the board, whether through a formal motion and a vote or just by head nodding, says, yeah, I think it would be a good idea to post that on a website, then the question would become, is anybody prejudiced by that if it didn't fit into an agenda item? I'm not a fan of very general things like governance requests, unless they stay within the bounds of a request. I would like information about blank. I would like information about blank. But a governance request agenda item that becomes discussion on a potential action and action by the board could be problematic. Yeah, I talked about before, the agenda requirement is a brief general description, generally not exceed 20 words. If all of the backup information for that's also posted and available for the public to see says more about what the board is doing, then that would become part of the facts that are relevant to whether you were operating in secrecy or not, or with less transparency than you should have. Err on the side of caution, err on the side of transparency is my recommendation.
Well, thank you. And is there any other questions? Okay, well, Trustee Burbeck, did
Do
you
we
have
have time? Yes.
we have very little
Can we just
time, but-
email him?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to ask. What I would suggest is that if you have additional questions, if you would email the superintendent, and then the superintendent can send
I do
those
have time for one more.
questions, and then the superintendent will share those answers to those questions with all of us. Does that sound fair? Does that sound good? Okay?
Mr. Z said he had time for one more. Did I read that right?
yeah.
Okay, is there one more question?
Okay, I'll ask it.
Trustee Burbeck.
Okay, so if a Brown Act violation occurs in closed session or in a serial meeting, but a board member doesn't have standing to file a complaint, so who's in charge of enforcing these types of Brown Act violations?
The statute says any person or the district attorney. Now, I know board members are persons, so you would think but there's a larger body of law related to limitations on a member of a board suing the board that they sit on, and expands beyond just the Brown Act. But that is a standing issue there's case law that a member of a board can't sue the board that they sit on for violations of the Brown Act. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, is that it's a collective responsibility for everybody to comply, because it's the board that's on the hook. It's not the 3 or 4 members that the individual board member is complaining about. It's the entire board. It's the entity.
Is reporting a violation the same thing as suing?
No. And, yeah, I remember saying to a board member years ago, I won't name the district, it wasn't San Diego Unified, I know I badmouthed them, so I'll just say that. But a board member said, you know, this board is engaging in repeated violations of the Brown Act. And I said, well, then I think you have a ethical responsibility to report that to the district attorney if you think that that's going on. I don't know whether that board member did, but that's a right that anybody has to report that, either to, again, other than board members, to the board itself through a demand, a cease and desist demand, or a cure or correct demand, or for board members to the district attorney.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much. Really
right.
appreciate the information.
Thank you.
And please, board members, if you do have additional questions, go through the superintendent, and then those answers would be shared with the rest of us. Thank you again. I appreciate it.
All right.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
move on
Take care.
to item 1.4, oral communication on closed session items. Have any blue cards been received for closed session items?
We do not have any blue cards.
Great, then we will recess to closed session. Thank you. Good evening. It is 6:03, and the board is reconvening from closed session. There is no action to report from closed session. Welcome, members of the public and board members and staff. Thank you for attending. As noted on Board Bylaw 9324, this meeting is being video recorded and broadcast via a link on our website. The recording and broadcast may capture images and sounds of those attending the meeting. I'd like to remind audience members and speakers that it is not unusual for students and young children to be in attendance at our meetings or to watch the recorded broadcast. I invite you to model civility and decorum as we go through the business of the board this evening. While I cannot prohibit anyone from using unprofessional language, please think about the students and adults who are watching our proceedings. We invite you to show support for a speaker by waving your fingers rather than clapping or cheering. We'll begin tonight's meeting with Student Board Representative Ailish Friestman leading in the Pledge of Allegiance. Trustee Verbeth will lead us in the moment of meditation. I will read from our meeting norms. Trustee Ward will read from the district vision, and Ms. Garcia will take the roll.
The holiday season has arrived, bringing with it the familiar flurry of activity, twinkling lights, an abundance of treats, and gatherings of friends and family around delicious food. This season often invites moments of quiet contemplation, allowing us to reflect on cherished memories while also creating new ones. While many consider this to be the most delightful time of year, it can also present challenges. For some, the season may evoke feelings of loss or a longing for distant relatives, leading to a sense of absence among loved ones. Financial pressures or loss of a job can add to the stress in the midst of the whirlwind of holiday activities, which may cause the season to pass by in a haze. During this holiday season, regardless of whether your festivities are filled with joy or tinged with nostalgia, it is important to remember that you are not alone. No matter how you choose to observe this time, may we all take a moment to reflect and be grateful for this incredible Carlsbad community and our school district, which is full of incredible educators, families, students, and traditions, which unify us despite our many differences. The people in this community make it the amazing place to live and raise our children. May you all have a very safe and happy holiday with your loved ones.
Thank you. And I'm reading from our meeting norms here. We first have motions and deliberations. We have a staff presentation. Then we have input from the public. We have trustee questions to staff, a motion, trustee discussion and deliberation, and then a vote. And then our meeting norms are everyone participates. We seek first to understand, then to be understood, stay on topic, listen before responding, keep discussion moving forward, remain objective, adhere to time, one conversation, and conduct ourselves with gracious professionalism.
Okay, I'm reading from our district vision. And our students are engaged, self-directed learners. They are exposed to different learning environments and pathways. Students aspire to expand their talents and achieve excellence. They are good thinkers, communicators, and problem solvers.
Thank you, and we will now take roll. Student Board Representative Friestman. Trustee Ciosi. Trustee Emery.
Here.
Trustee Ward.
Here.
Trustee Verbeth.
Here.
Trustee Rawlings.
Here. Thank you. And we now move on to Part 4, approval of the agenda. Trustees, are there any questions? May I have a motion to approve Agenda Item 4.1, approval and/or reorganization of the December 18th, 2024 meeting agenda?
Motion.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion from Trustee Ward, second from Trustee Verbeth. And is there any discussion? No discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee Ciosi.
Yes.
Trustee Emery.
Yes.
Trustee Ward.
Yes.
Trustee Verbeth.
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to Part 5, organization of the board. Part 5.1, annual organizational meeting. And I would just like to say I appreciate the opportunity to reside over the meetings as president over the last year. And I believe we have done some good work, and we've been able to run efficient and on-time meetings. So I appreciate that. And trustees, I will now hand it over to Mr. Rick Schmidt.
Thank you, Trustee Rollins, and I'd like to begin by saying that this is an annual organization of the Carlsbad Unified School District Board of Trustees on December 18th, 2024. In conformance with Bylaw 9100, at this time, the Board of Trustees meeting is adjourned for the purpose of reorganization to elect a new president, vice president, and clerk of the board for the 2025 calendar year. The board may do this by verbally making and accepting nominations, followed by a motion, a second, and roll call voting. As soon as the new board president is elected, they will immediately assume the role of president and will commence with the remaining elections, the remaining elections, and then we'll proceed with the other items on the agenda. Okay. Oh, want me to read all of that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Or I can do it too.
I can do it.
Okay.
It's easy. Ms. Garcia, any blue card, are there any blue cards that have been received for this section?
We do not have any blue cards.
Okay, thank you. Like I said, feedback welcome. The floor is now open for nominations for president of the board. I'll take a nomination before asking for a motion.
I would like to make a nomination for president. I would like to nominate Kathy Rawlings as the board president again. And my reasoning, I would just like to share that we have quite a bit of transition that's going to be happening, where we have to elect a superintendent, and I know that she is familiar with that process, and she is the only one that is familiar with that process. So I would like to see her in that role again, and help lead us to find our next superintendent, and also to continue with some of the practices that we have had.
I would like to nominate Gretchen for Beth.
Okay. Any other nominations? Any discussion? Any questions for staff?
Now you can accept a motion for one of the
Okay.
either candidate.
Would anyone like to second a motion for either of the two candidates?
I would like to second for Kathy Rawlings.
Any other seconds? Second for Ms. Burbeth?
Can I second myself?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. You can? Okay.
Well, then I second myself.
Now it's for discussion.
Okay. Discussion? Any discussion?
I'd like to discuss some. So it's been the practice of our school district for 20-plus years to have a succession from clerk to vice president to president. During the vice president's year, she or he does attend the planning agenda meetings and also goes to board governance or to board president training workshop, which I just attended at CSBA, and I feel that I'm quite capable of leading, and I have appreciated Kathy Rawlings as our president, but I think it's time to rotate so that each of us can have a opportunity to maintain the succession and continue training the rest of the trustees. So I would like to just state that I believe that it's appropriate to move forward and in our succession.
Okay. Trustee COC?
No.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbeff?
No.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 3-2.
Please let the record show that trustee Rollins has been elected as president of the Board of Trustees for 2025.
Thank you, and thank you for trusting me for another year to lead as president. Oh. This one?
Yes.
Okay, do we want to do this or just do that? That would be you if you want to do it.
Okay, want me to introduce that?
No, you don't have to.
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay, you don't have to.
Okay.
We don't have to do that part. Okay. Okay, we will now move on to item 5.3, organization of the board election for vice president of the Board of Trustees. The floor is now open for nominations for vice president of the board. And I'd like to nominate trustee Ward for vice president. Any other nominations?
I'm going to nominate Gretchen for Beth. We're going to keep with tradition, and let's keep it
Thank
rolling.
you. Any other nominations? Hearing not additional, we have 2 nominations. We have one for trustee Ward, and we have another one for trustee for Beth. May I have a motion for, or I'll make the motion for trustee Ward. May I have a second? May I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second, and then do we have a motion for trustee Verbeff?
I'll make a motion for myself. Thank you.
Do I have a second? No.
Can I second?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll second.
Thank you. And I also have a motion and a second for trustee Verbeff for vice president as well. Any discussion? Okay.
Some discussion. So
Go ahead.
it's also been our practice to alternate from president to vice president. We're not a partisan organization, but we know that we have different philosophies. And so it's a nice balance of power to have an alternation. And that creates a nice flow and diversity of viewpoint of thought and expression of those thoughts. And so I think we would be going outside of what has been traditionally done in our practices here, which has worked very well for many years. And so I would like to just speak to that and the importance of maintaining that.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Trustee Ward?
Yeah, and that is truly a valid point, or trustee Verbeff. So thank you for sharing that. I also want to say that, not everything has to be tradition. Sometimes things change. We don't have our old superintendent anymore. We have an interim now, and we're going to be looking for a new superintendent. So I think that as things change, and I think that's something that we realized with COVID, is that we need to be able to be flexible and to, try different things and look at things differently. And I think that's okay.
And any other discussion? Because I have something to say as well, but go ahead, trustee
Yeah, I have
Verbeff.
a follow-up to that. So thank you for your comment too, trustee Ward. It's really important when we go into these meetings, that especially agenda planning, where we have a balanced thought and perspective, And I understand what you're saying. Sometimes tradition doesn't always have to remain, but I think if you're running a company or you're running a school district, you want to have balance of thought to represent all of the constituents, all of the viewpoints, and if Trustee Rawlings is president and Trustee Ward is vice president, then we will not have that balance. We will not have all constituents, as far as I'm concerned, be equally represented. So I don't think it's a wise choice. And so thank you.
Trustee Emery.
As being new to this board, can you please explain to me how that balance or the change might affect things? As I'm not sure.
Oh, sure. So with any kind of, whether it's PTA or, running a business or being on a school board, you have diversity of thought, right? And so it's important to welcome all ideas openly and to be able to feel safe expressing those and to bring those to the table. And so when you are coming into a meeting, especially like a board agenda planning meeting where you're planning the agenda, it's important to have different viewpoints.
Trustee Ward.
I'm sorry if you haven't felt safe in expressing your thoughts, but I just want to say that my nomination for Trustee Rawlings to be president is with a lot of the changes that are happening and with her familiarity with that from past experiences. So, and her and I have had differences in opinions and views sitting on this board. So I'm not really sure what you're speaking to, but, we are not the same person. We don't think exactly the same. So we do have difference of opinions. And I think that because of that nomination, it doesn't mean that, we're thinking exactly the same with everything. If you look back at our previous board meetings, there are some things that we have disagreed on.
Trustee Emery.
I suppose that was a clarification. And my question is, what would, you were speaking of difference of viewpoints, and I was wondering what perhaps those viewpoints might be that you see as different.
Well, it's that we come up with an agenda, and it's good to have a balance where somebody might bring in a viewpoint that says, you know what, I'm not in agreement with you on this, and you know what, I think we do need to discuss this, or we do need to put something else on the agenda, which you have to have a discussion during that meeting. And so I appreciate that Trustee Ward is expressing that she's a different person than Trustee Rawlings. I totally understand that. But we also know in this room that, there are more conservative viewpoints and there are, not as conservative viewpoints. And sometimes those issues come before the board.
Any other discussion?
I think the argument that you've made to nominate yourself and retain your role as
We're only speaking about vice president now?
the argument made to keep things status quo was because the experience that you have in this role, and I would argue the same can be said for Trustee Verbuff, that she has served alongside you for the last year. And so if we're trying to keep with consistency as we are amidst all this other change in our district, then it would make sense to keep both the president and the vice president the same for the 2025 year.
Thank you. Any other discussion? I would just like to say that 2 years ago, this came up with Trustee Pearson. And so each trustee owns their vote. And so obviously we can make arguments to persuade our fellow trustees and that sort of thing. But ultimately, each trustee does own their vote when it comes to not only the positions on the board, but also every agenda item there is. So that's what I would like to say as my discussion. Any other discussion? Another discussion? I'd like to, Ms. Garcia, call for the vote for Trustee Ward for vice president.
Trustee COC?
No.
Trustee Emery?
No.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
No.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion fails 3-2.
And will you call for a vote for trustee Verbath?
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
No.
Trustee Ward?
Yes. Or no, sorry.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
No.
Motion
So
fails
both
3 to
motions
2.
fail. So we would have to go back and, we would have to go back and reconsider?
Yes.
Would be parliamentarian? Yes, okay. So we'll go back and reconsider. Is there any other discussion that you'd like to bring forward before we do another vote?
May I just have
Trustee
some
Emery.
further clarification about when you're making agenda items? Is that purely between the president and the vice president? Or is the whole board involved in those agenda items and planning meetings?
Our board bylaw says that the cabinet, our executive cabinet, the superintendent, the board president, and the board vice president are only in those planning meetings.
And that the current board bylaw does say that the superintendent and the president create the agenda with the input from the vice president and the cabinet, is what our current bylaw says. Any other discussion? Okay, let's go ahead and we'll revote for trustee Ward for vice president. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote. We already have the motions in the second, but because both failed, so we already have them, correct, parliamentary?
I believe so.
Okay, very good.
Vote again.
Right, okay. So we're revoting. So we're going to start
Unless
with,
somebody wants to
Right.
make a motion for a different individual.
Mr. Dill.
Yeah, I believe since there was a motion and a second, a vote twice, that the procedure should be that there is a new motion and a second to be voted on again.
Then I'm going to even take it a one step further. I'll entertain nominations for the position of vice president. Are there any nominations? I'd like to nominate trustee Ward for vice president. So there's not a second at this point. Are there additional nominations? Hearing none, may I have a motion? I will make a motion to have trustee Ward be the vice president. May I have is there a second?
I'll
I will
second.
Oh,
Sorry.
Okay, so trustee Emery seconded. Any discussion? No discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
No.
Trustee Emery?
yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
No.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 3-2.
Thank you. Please let the record show that trustee Ward has been elected as vice president of the Board of Trustees for 2025. Uh, 5.4, organization of the board, election clerk of the Board of Trustees. The floor is now open for nominations for clerk of the board. Are there any nominations?
Yes, I'd like to nominate Laura Ciozzi, trustee Ciozzi.
Laura Sayosi, or trustee Sayosi has been nominated for clerk. Are there any additional nominations?
I would like to nominate trustee Verbath.
Okay, we have trustee Verbath and trustee Sayosi. Any additional nominations? Okay. May I have a motion to approve trustee Sayosi as clerk of the board?
Make a motion for trustee Ciozzi.
Is there a second? Fails for a lack of a second. May I have a motion to approve trustee Verbath as clerk?
Yes.
May I have a motion? Okay, you need to say, I move.
I move.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion from trustee Sayosi, a second from trustee Ward. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I heard what you said, and to respect that, I think it would be a good idea to have you on as clerk.
Thank you.
Any additional discussion? No additional discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. And please let the record show that trustee Verbev has been elected as clerk of the Board of Trustees for 2025. Okay, then we can move on to item 5.5, organization of the board, appointment of the interim superintendent as the secretary to the Board of Trustees. I recommend we appoint interim superintendent Rick Schmidt as the secretary of the Board of Trustees. May I have a motion to approve Mr. Schmidt as our secretary and
So
superintendent?
moved. Verbev?
Second.
Moved by Verbev, seconded by Ward. Is there any discussion? No discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Okay, and we have item 5.6, organization of the board, authorized signatures. May I have a motion to approve authorized signatures for the district as presented?
Motion?
Second?
We have a motion by trustee Ward, second by trustee Verbev. Do we have any discussion? No discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. And item 5.7, organization of the board, the school board meeting schedule. May I have a motion to approve the 2025 schedule of board meetings as presented? Then I'll make the motion to approve the schedule. May I have a second?
Second.
We have a second from trustee Emery. Any discussion? Trustee Ward.
Thank you. I wanted to ask my colleagues if it would be okay if we could change the date for the February 19th meeting. I won't be present for that meeting, and I want to be able to be present at every meeting because my attendance has been perfect. So if we could have it at either on February 5th is my hope, but I can also do it on the 12th. Those are the two previous Wednesdays.
I'm unavailable on the 5th, but I could be available on the 12th if other board members are so inclined.
12 works for me.
Trustee Verbev,
As well.
trustee Emery, and trustee Sayosi. Do you have any objections to that? Okay.
Thank you.
So if we could, and our practice is to show thumbs. So if we could have thumbs to change the February 19th meeting to the February 12th. And so if you, okay, that's 5. Okay, so if we could make that change. Any other discussion?
Can I ask a question?
Trustee Verbev?
Why are there two regular meetings in June?
I can answer that. It's
Go
very
ahead.
traditional that school boards meet twice in June to adopt the budget. It's a two-step process, and it gives staff time to get those budgets built by June 30 deadline.
I just thought it was named something else, that's all.
There's public hearing requirements for the LCAP and the budget, and they cannot be adopted the same night as the public hearing.
That's right, thank you.
And I will say you will notice that at this time, we do not have a meeting in July. So we do have 2 meetings in June, but we do not have a meeting scheduled for July. Is there any other discussion? Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. 5.8, organization of the Board of Trustees Committee Representative Appointments for 2025. Trustees, are there any questions? No questions. May I have a motion to approve the 2025 Trustee Committee Representative appointments as presented?
Motion?
I'll second. She motions.
Trustee Emery made the motion and Trustee Ward seconded. Is there discussion? I have some discussion. Trustee Verbev?
Yes, I believe when I came on and I was clerk my first year, so it's my third year, I thought I was on the Carlsbad Health and Wellness Committee. I see now that it is assigned to the board president, board vice president. Since this is my background as an exercise physiologist and I have a passion about it, I would really like to be on this committee. I'm not sure why it's been organized with board president and board vice president. I'd be happy to change. And yeah, so we'll start with that one.
So are you asking for consensus for something?
Sure.
Okay.
I'd like consensus to add or take off board president, board vice president as a requirement, and maybe it's just board president and another trustee. I don't remember ever seeing board president and board vice president as a requirement, but maybe it's been that way, Kathy, or trustee.
This was as it was presented to us from, and I believe Dr. Churchill put it together, so I'm not really sure either, to be honest. But so I'm not sure what you're asking so you're asking for consensus to do what?
To remove the board vice president. I mean, if Michelle, trustee Ward wants to be on this committee, that's fine. I just feel that I'd like to have some, I'd like to be on that board, or on that committee, excuse me.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is you'd like to get consensus to have the president and yourself assigned to that committee.
Yes, please.
Okay. Is there consensus for that? By a show of thumbs? I see at least 3 thumbs. So if we could make that change to that part, are there other discussion? I have a discussion as well. Okay, I would like to actually, now that if you're going to be on this committee, I think it makes it a little easier. I would like to be assigned to the subcommittee for career pathways with trustee COC.
That's
So I'd
fine.
like to see if I could have consensus for that. So there's at least 4 thumbs for that. So if we could make that change. And then with your permission, trustee Verbeth, if you would be moved to the audit committee with trustee COC. Because as president, I would be on more committees than I think is reasonable. So then you would be on the wellness, and then you'd be taken off of the career, but then assigned to the audit committee. Okay, and then if I could have consensus for that. Okay, so there's 5 thumbs there. Other discussion. Trustee Verbeth.
I did talk about this with our interim superintendent about the NICSE, North Coastal Consortium for Special Education. The first year that I served on this, we had 1 meeting. Last year, there was 0 meetings. So I just am curious, do we have any plan to create a meeting, or who's in charge of this, and how will I know?
Good question, and thanks for bringing that up. So I have my first NICSE meeting in January, and I will make sure that that is brought up as a topic of discussion and strongly suggest that that committee reconvenes this school year.
Any other discussion? Okay, Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. Thank you. And item 5.9, organization of the board, resolution number 192425, role and responsibilities of members of the Board of Trustees. I may have a motion to approve resolution number 192425, role and responsibilities of members of the Board of Trustees, Exhibit D.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by trustee Verbeth, second by trustee Ward. Is there any discussion? I would just like to say that this is the resolution in front of you, and what we do is that we go around we go around in a circle and each one of us reads one section of this resolution once we've passed the motion. Any other discussion? Okay, Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee Cioce?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. And I'd like to start with trustee Cioce for number 1.
As a school board member, I know that my primary responsibility is to the child. I am, in effect, the adult conscience of my community with regard to the welfare of children. The welfare of the child will therefore be my first consideration in my actions as a board member.
As a school board member, I know that my second responsibility is to the citizens who elected me. I am, in effect, the will of many people. What I do reflects their concerns about human growth and development. What I do determines the price they will pay for educational services. The concerns of district citizens will, therefore, be my second consideration in my actions as a board member.
As a school board member, I recognize that I am a major employer. What I do will affect the capacity of many people to practice the profession or trade in which they have so much personal investment. What I do will affect material quality of their lives and the lives of their children. Justice for the people I employ will, therefore, be my third consideration in my actions as a board member.
As a school board member, I realize that I represent the authority of government. I possess the power to grant and to deny. But the power is not mine individually. It represents the delegated authority of the majority. In a democracy, it should be exercised with concern and care for the least influential member of society. That is, the rights of the minority must be protected. Concern for every individual will thus be my fourth consideration in my actions as a board member.
As a school board member, I realize that I am but one element of a policy-making body. As such, I have no authority outside the official meetings, dependent in part on my ability to work with my fellow board members in a spirit of harmony and cooperation, despite differences of opinion that may arise. I further recognize that administration of the educational program and the conduct of school business is the responsibility of the superintendent of schools and his or her staff. A sense of loyalty to associates and respect for group decisions cooperatively reached will therefore be my fifth consideration in my action as a board member. And trustee Cioce, you have the last one as well.
As a school board member, I acknowledge that I am a separate individual. My feelings and views are unique to me based on my own personal experiences. Like all other individuals, I have something to contribute to the sum of society. Unlike most individuals, I have the opportunity and the responsibility to make some of these contributions as a board member and will do so to the best of my ability. My personal feelings and concepts will therefore be my sixth consideration in my actions as a board member.
Thank you. And we are now back in regular session. We'll now proceed to Part 6, Communications, Part 1, 6.1, Report by a Student Representative to the Board. I now welcome Carlsbad Village Academy student Ailish Friestman, who will provide the board with a student report.
As we approach the end of the semester, students at Carlsbad Village Academy and Carlsbad Seaside Academy are working diligently to finish strong. At Seaside, students are focused on meeting deadlines to stay on track in their independent study classes. The quick turnaround after winter break has added urgency for many students to catch up on assignments and ensure they are fully prepared for the next semester. Seniors in particular have been highly engaged in career exploration and post-secondary preparation. At Carlsbad Village Academy, students have participated in career chats, including a recent visit from three captains of local Trader Joe's stores who shared their leadership journeys and professional insights. Futures Academy seniors also had the unique opportunity to attend a presentation featuring women in federal law enforcement, gaining valuable perspective on careers in the U.S. Postal Service and related fields. As the semester continues, seniors at Carlsbad Village Academy will continue their capstone projects in senior English, which includes career research, presentations, and mock interviews. These activities are designed to help the students develop their professional communication skills, and prepare for future educational and career opportunities. Across both schools, students are demonstrating focus and determination as they work to meet their goals and prepare for success beyond high school. At Sage Creek High School, this week, they are celebrating the winter season with Seasonal Spirit Week. Monday was Wear Your Favorite Flannel Day. Tuesday was Snowed In. Wednesday, Ugly Sweater. Thursday was Festival Fun. And Friday, Whiteout. For National Hot Chocolate Day, ASB handed out free hot chocolate during lunchtime. Recently, their Hoop Coming theme was released with Down in the Bayou. Today, girls and boys basketball had a game at 5:30 and 7:30. Girls soccer will have their game tomorrow at 4 and boys soccer at 6. The theme for their games this week is Starry Night. Lastly, Girls Rising Club is hosting a supply drive. Any extra supplies would be appreciated, and all donations will go directly to underprivileged schools in India. At Carlsbad High School, they are in full go with their winter sports. We also hosted a Lancer Day market last week with student-made vendors like homemade clothes and candles. After that, they hosted a blood drive gathering over 50 pints. This past weekend, they hosted a cheer competition, and our cheer team competed. Our comp cheer team competed. Band and orchestra will have performances this week. After everybody returns from breaks, students will be preparing for first semester finals and wrapping up the first half of the year.
Thank you. And we now move on to item 6.2, Superintendent Report. Mr. Rick Schmidt.
Thank you very much. And before I actually share my brief report, I'd like to present to you, Kathy, this token of appreciation for your year as serving as the president of the Board of Trustees here in the Carlsbad Unified School District. And what it says is, it's from the Carlsbad Unified School District. Thank you for your dedication and service to the Carlsbad Unified School District and the students, staff, and families of Carlsbad, December 18, 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate it.
Okay, I just have two very brief items. One, just again, thanking the trustees and public for them believing in me and allowing me to do work to support you and work with this community moving forward over the next few months. And then I attended last Friday, and thank you for two of our trustees, Ms. Verbeff and Ms. Rawlings, for joining me at the Local Legislative Action Network. Representatives from this district, Cardiff Elementary, Del Mar, Encinitas, Rancho Santa Fe, San Diego, and Solana Beach. We also had representatives from 4 elected officials in that session, and that were representatives from State Senators Blakespeare and Jones, both San Diego County, and then Congressman Scott Peters and Congressman Mike Levin. And the 3 items, as I mentioned in a brief report on Friday, really was around, all 3 actually were about money. Imagine that. One was the long-term fiscal stability of school districts in the state of California. One was special ed funding, which has been part of my 40-plus year career, meeting those challenges, and then maintaining local control. And I thought what was most interesting is regardless of the school district, our challenges are really the same with the focus on special ed. And again, that's not new, but the costs each and every year have escalated. The point of finding skilled and credentialed special educators to work with our students has become more challenging than ever. And the funding comes and it goes. It's never really been consistent. So there was good discussion and good information there, I believe. And it's always good to get elected officials in the school community in one room and have those really good conversations. So again, thank the two of you for being there.
Thank you. And we now move on to item 6.3, oral communications, public comment on non-agenda items. This is the time that members of the public have the opportunity to address the board on any non-agendized item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. How many blue cards have been received for non-agenda items?
We have one blue card.
Thank you. In order to allow speakers to present their comments and ensure we are able to properly attend to the business of the board, per Board Bylaw 9323, public comments will be limited to 20 minutes. This means each speaker will have 3 minutes. When I call your name, please come to the podium, state your name, and indicate whether or not you live within the boundaries of the school district. This speaker is Laura Pitts.
Good evening. Welcome, new trustees and interim superintendent. It's nice to see all of you tonight. I have 2 boys that attend Calavera Elementary School, and I am the CEO at Carlsbad Educational Foundation. So I believe that both of you are familiar with the foundation, but if not, we raise funds to support critical programs within our school district, as well as offer programs after school for families. And I've got 2 updates for you tonight. The first is that Carlsbad Educational Foundation's Board of Directors just recently approved a 3-year strategic plan. And it is a place where 2 emerging themes really came out, reconfirming our direction that we've been heading in the last couple of years and our commitment for the next couple of years. So the first is that we are here to bridge educational gaps by creating and supporting critical music and STEAM programs. And what this looks like in practice is that above all else, when we're prioritizing our funding, we're going to make sure that we're protecting things like elementary music teachers, elementary STEAM teachers, music education within our secondary programs. So some of those core programs and funding that the district's come accustomed to. The second thing that we are looking to elevate and continue to fund is that we are going to fund, foster, and facilitate innovative programs. And in a couple of ways, this year it looks like we rolled out teacher grants to our secondary teachers. And so this allowed us to give funds directly to secondary teachers that had innovative ideas or needed extra funding to elevate things in their classroom. And the other area is that we fund a number of programs within our career education space. And with the recent approval of the CUSD's TK through 12 Career Development Continuum and the strategic plan, we are looking forward to continuing to support programs that elevate that initiative. And so at this time of the year, I also want to just remind the community and remind the board that this is made possible because of our amazing community that either chooses to put their kids in Carlsbad Educational Foundation programs. Again, these proceeds go towards funding these vital programs. But really importantly, it's also the philanthropic giving. And so we are heading towards the end of our annual fund drive. Our goal was to raise $50,000 during this campaign, and we're about halfway there. And this last part of the month is a really critical piece. And I just want to encourage the whole community, is any little amount helps. So just getting involved and helping to really elevate this philanthropic community is what we're here to do and to help our students. And so at this time, we wish everybody a great, happy holiday and a safe time off, and hope that you will consider us during your annual giving. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to Part 7, Consent Calendar. All matters listed on the consent calendar are considered by the board to be routine and will be enacted by the board in one motion. There will be no discussion on these items prior to the time the board votes on the motion, unless there is a board request for one or more specific items to be removed from the consent calendar for discussion. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
With no blue cards, trustees, are there any items to be pulled for discussion? None to be pulled. May I have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion from trustee Verbath, second from trustee Ward. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to Part 8, Information, Discussion, Action Items. Item 8.1, First Interim Financial Report for the period ending October 31st, 2024. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mr. Eric Dill.
Thank you, President Rawlings. This evening, I will be presenting the first interim budget report. This is the first update to the board on the state of the district's budget since adoption of the budget in June. Often, the board is adopting the budget before all things are known in Sacramento, as their Budget Act often is not passed until after our requirement to pass a budget. And then there's other developments that happen through the year. And so this is our opportunity to bring those changes to you for review, and I'll walk you through the changes in revenue and expenditures as we see them thus far. What I will say is that the first interim budget report is probably always the worst case scenario budget for the district, and the reason why is that we've added in expenditures that have carried over from the previous year. We haven't had a chance to really capture savings in budgets and reduce them at this point in the year, and that's the work that we do between now and the second interim budget and the estimated actuals in the spring. So really what you see is probably our highest expectation of what our expenditures would be, also the lowest expectation of what our revenue would be. And both of those things will move as we get through the year. So here's where we are as of today in the themes. We will present to you a positive certification. That means we can meet our financial obligations for the current and the next 2 fiscal years and maintain our minimum reserves. We have adjusted the beginning balances. This is another thing that is not known when we adopt the budget in June. We have an estimate on what our ending balances will be from last year, but then we close the books and we have the actual number that becomes the beginning balances for this year. So I have adjusted those in this report as well. And finally, next month is when we start budget development for the following school year. That season begins officially on January 10th when the governor releases his budget proposal to the legislature. So the very high-level summary, the all-in comparison of adopted budget to first interim, you can see changes to revenue and expenditures. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but this is the very high-level summary. You see the asterisks next to beginning balance and ending balance. Those are as adjusted after we close the book. So if you were to look back at the adopted budget report, you would have a different number, but for purposes of this slide, I wanted to make things all things being equal. If we had known down to the penny where our balance would be, it would have been that. There are 2 pieces of the general fund. There's the unrestricted general fund and the restricted general fund. The restricted general fund are those dollars that come with strings attached, and that's mainly from the federal government and the state funding. So we receive dollars from that, but we can only spend them in certain ways. And so we always capture those restricted funds separately from the unrestricted. The unrestricted is the bulk of our general fund, and those really are, for the most part, our free purpose dollars that we can spend for any operational reason that we see fit. So this is why it's also important to show the difference between the unrestricted and restricted, because the most important thing is the unrestricted ending balance. Just a walk down memory lane, I always like to show this slide just graphically showing where we've been over the years. In a perfect world, dollars in would equal dollars out every year, but we don't live in a perfect world, so sometimes we have a little bit more revenue than our expenditures. Other years we have a little bit more in expenditures than we have in revenue. The trick is to make that as tight as possible. And in the last few years, the patterns have been a little different in that we received significant amounts of one-time money through grants, one-time infusions of funding related to COVID and the recovery after that. And very often those dollars were received in one year but spent in the following year. So we'll see a spike in revenue one year, and if we don't spend all of that revenue, the next year we see a spike in expenditures, and that really has been the pattern for us. So the green and the blue are the total general fund revenue and expenditures, but I do break out the unrestricted ending balance and the restricted ending balance in the orange and the black. So you can see across relative stability as we look across over the years. And the final 2, I have the dotted line there. As this budget is presented to you throughout the year, to the right of the dotted line, we'll see how the budget report has changed since the last iteration that we bring to you. This will be the first time that that two trustees will hear me say that the budget is a plan, and so we adopt the plan in June, and it is a plan throughout the year, and then we close the books and we come back and tell you what really happened. So it's a plan, it's a plan, it's a plan, and then we close the books and we know what happened. So this is just a reflection of our plans as they sit today. So now, getting into the changes in revenue, a slight adjustment in the local control funding formula and property tax. That's less than 1%. So we watch that revenue as it comes in, and so we'll make adjustments on that as we get more information from the property tax collector. We are what is called a basic aid district or a community funded district, which means right now we are exceeding our entitlement to local control funding formula, so we get to keep that excess tax. That's kept us treading water this year compared to where we thought we would be a year ago. It's fortunate that we now are basic aid as we're not as subject to what is going on economically at the state level and the state's ability to fund public education, and we are not going to be as subject to swings in average daily attendance impacting our revenue. It really is our local tax base. However, those are reported on the same line, whether it's LCFF or property tax, so you're always going to see that on the top line. Federal, it's very common to see minor adjustments on federal revenue throughout the year. State revenue, I'll talk about that in just a moment. The bulk of that is revenue that is a transaction on paper, and I'll walk you through that on the next slide as I break it down. And then local revenue, you just heard Ms. Pitts talk about donations that CEF has brought into the district, also our PTAs and other people who are generous and give us donation dollars. Also things like facility use would be included in our local revenue. Because we don't know if somebody's going to rent a facility or write us a check, we don't put in a budget for that revenue for donations until it actually comes in. So there are some things that we do get commitments from CEF, and we do budget for that because they have a history of supporting us at certain levels and they give us commitments. But other smaller donations, we recognize that revenue as it comes in. Often, as we receive donation revenue, that also comes with strings attached because the donor would like us to use it for a specific purpose. So you'll see the expenditure budget go up at the same clip. So just in words, talking about the changes, really I'll talk about the state revenue. The big piece on that is what's called STRS on behalf, and you're going to see the exact same dollar on the expenditure side as well. This is revenue that we don't receive for an expenditure that we don't have. It's something that we just have to recognize on paper, the value of the state's contribution to the state teachers' retirement system that they make on our behalf. We have to show it on our books, but they don't actually give us money for it, and we don't actually make that expenditure. So we added in that the value of that STRS on behalf at first interim. So both revenue and expenditures went up by that exact same dollar amount as we reflected that in the budget. On special education, we had some adjustments in the revenue, and that's always good to see more revenue. We, as part of a SELPA, we share revenue, and we get allocations of revenue based on all of the district's attendance in the SELPA. And so as other districts will decline and grow at different rates, they true up those amounts to us. And so it's sometimes dependent on where other districts are landing on how much passes through to our district in the SELPA. So we did see an increase in SPED revenue, so that's very good news. CTE, we had 2 grants that we had award letters for that were, the dollar amounts were not known and adopted, so we've added in the value of those 2 CTE grants, and we also had an adjustment on our lottery revenue. And at the bottom, I mentioned on the previous slide why we increase grant and donation revenue as it comes in through the year. So just revenue components, again, looking back and on the right side of the dotted line, looking forward from adoption to where we are now. If you look at the blue, which is the most valuable piece of revenue that we have, our LCFF and property tax, that's the largest and most stable amount. The green and the orange representing our federal and state revenue, We're definitely settling down on the federal revenue to what our historical level has been. We had spikes. You will notice that those bars were bigger in 2020, 2021, 2022, because we were receiving support from the federal government that we don't normally receive. Same with the state revenue. Those dollars definitely grew in 2021 and 22, and now we've seen those funds not pass through in this upcoming current year, so we're coming back down to earth on the state revenue as well. So we're getting kind of back to our historical levels of funding for federal and state. And again, the black bar, that's going to keep growing throughout the year as we recognize more local revenue. So this slide here just points out our status as a basic aid district, with the blue bar being our entitlement to local control funding formula revenue under the current grant amounts for the base grant and the supplemental grant, multiplied times our average daily attendance, and the orange line being the value of our property tax that we receive. And so right now in 2024, you can see that the orange line is above the blue bar. And so that is when you are in community funded status, and we are able to retain that excess revenue. Had we not been so close to basic aid status this year, you see that we would have had a decline in that revenue because of declining enrollment, plus a very low cost of living adjustment on the local control funding formula this year. So very fortunate for us that we ended up this year exactly where we thought we would be a year ago before the COLA dropped. And then using some cautious assumptions on everything, our property tax growth and cautious assumptions on our enrollment and the projection out on the local control funding formula, it looks like we are in basic aid to stay this time. This is the third time that the district has entered into basic aid. We were during the Great Recession when state funding was cut below our property tax level, so we were basic aid by accident during that time. We dipped a toe in the water in 2020, 2021, and that was really because the state did not fund a COLA that year, so we just blipped briefly in, and the following year we fell out of it. But as far as we can see out into the future, we're going to remain in basic aid. Okay, now moving on to expenditures, and I think it's probably better if I just move on to the next slide because I've got the explanations as I go through each of these items. So moving on, certificate and classified salaries. We did add some additional middle school support teachers this year using the Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Discretionary Block Grant. We also added in the value of those donation-funded hourly support teachers. So as we saw the revenue come in, we also had this obligation to meet the will of the donors and provide that hourly support. So that comes in by way of the donation-funded hourly support donations. The third item on there, that's captured savings for instructional assistants and vacancies that we've had to date. Some of that has had to be moved over into the services category as we've had an obligation to still provide the services to students as we've looked to find people to fill those roles. I'll say that our vacancies this year are much lower than they have been in prior years, and so we're doing a much better job at being able to hire our own people, which is definitely what our goal is in all of this. We would rather spend those dollars on our own folks, and it's much more cost effective than agencies that add profit and overhead on top of that cost. On benefits, STRS on behalf, again, that's an equal amount that you saw on the revenue side, so it really has no impact on the bottom line. Some districts don't put this in until the end of the year. We've typically put it in either at adoption or at first, depending on if we can get that calculation in on time. So the next two items were were not planned for. And so this is where I say that in a number of budget categories, we did not have the correct rates in for health and welfare benefits and some other statutory benefits, and it was spread out through the entire budget. And so as we have looked at projecting out those benefit costs throughout the end of the year, we noticed that we needed to make this adjustment. So this was something that was incorrect at adoption. We've made that correction now. As we head into our budget adoption cycle beginning next month, we're looking at exactly how did that happen so that we make sure that as we are building the budget for next year, we've got the correct rates in for every one of our budget categories so that we're accurately budgeting for both our health and welfare and our other statutory benefits. So my apologies to the board for that. And then materials and services, that's a rather large number when we add all of that up, but that really is the carryover. So it's the restricted carryover that was for federal and state funds that were not spent last year. Those dollars are now available to spend this year. And so it is very, very typical that you see a large increase for materials and supplies and services related to carryover at first interim, because we didn't know what those balances were going to be before we closed the books. Now we know what that is. We release that back either to departments or to school sites for them to be able to use. Often there's also carryover in some donation funds that the sites have, and so we release those dollars back to the sites and they build those back into their budgets, mainly for books, supplies, and other materials. So that's all captured in that $2.6 million. That part was not a surprise. So expenditure components, again, just looking at those different categories and how that compares, looking back over the previous years and where we were at adopted, and just showing that graphically. So getting into the ending balance and our multi-year projection, pulling this apart, looking at the unrestricted and restricted ending balances. And as we move out through the year, you'll see the second interim column being added and then the estimated actuals at adoption. So you'll see all four estimates of the budget as we move through the year. Ultimately, the ending fund balance drops by $2.4 million. It's roughly a change of a little over $1 million on the unrestricted side, and then the other 1.4-ish million is on the restricted side. We've got components of the ending balance below, and we are able to meet our board-required 5% minimum reserve and also retain the other commitments that the board has for the ending balance as well. So we do meet our positive certification criteria. This is really explained on the next slide here, showing that as we look out to the next 2 years plus this year, we do have sufficient reserves to meet our minimum reserve requirements for the next 2 years. So next up for us is that we would request that you adopt the first interim budget report. We will be watching the governor's budget proposal on January 10th. As a basic aid district, the cost of living adjustment that he will mention or propose is not as important to us because our revenue is not coming from the local control funding formula. However, that's important to us for special education revenue, expanded learning opportunities program revenue, a number of other state programs that we have, so we'll be watching that. In addition to whether or not there are any other one-time funding proposals that might be mentioned that we would qualify for. So I have the pleasure of watching all 3 hours of the governor's press conference when it happens, and I download all the information and will provide a very quick, high-level summary to the board on January 10th of how I see those proposals potentially impacting Carlsbad Unified. And so with that, I'm ready for, I'll throw it back to Trustee Rawlings for public comment, discussion, and questions.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
With no blue cards, trustees, do you have any questions? Trustee Emery?
Yes, I have a question. When you're referring to the health and welfare benefits and that rate shift, is that due to, I know that VIVA saw some unintended increases that were unexpected, or is that due to another calculation there?
No, that was a budget error. And so at this point in the year, we did have the rates and an estimate of the rate increases for next year. But some of those rates it was prior year that was built in. And so that was something that was not caught, and we've made that adjustment.
Other questions? Trustee Ward?
So I'm just trying to understand this, so if you can explain it to me. So you were saying that there were some increases, but they will level out with the STRS on behalf payments. Can you just explain
Sure.
that to me a little bit better? And is the state giving us money back? And so that's, or they're, because I know they pay a portion of that, right?
Correct.
So if you could just
Sure.
explain that to me a little bit.
Sure, it's my least favorite part of the budget because none of it is actually real. So many years ago, the Government Accounting Standards Board released a requirement that required districts to report in their budgets the value of the state's contribution to STRS that they make on our behalf. So, there's three pieces of it. There's the district's contribution, there's the employee's contribution, and then the state also makes a contribution to STRS. We very clearly show our contribution because that's our cost. The employee's contribution comes out of their paycheck, so that doesn't show up in our budget. But then we have this basically phantom expenditure that occurs. And so we put on the revenue side and the expenditure side exactly equal amounts that are our estimate of what the state's contribution on our behalf is. That's why it's called STRS on behalf, and we track it separately from our other STRS payments. And so that is just built into the budget. And again, because we're showing revenue and expenditures going up by the exact same amounts, it has no impact on our bottom line whatsoever. And so we'll show this as in the budget. They don't actually occur. When we close the budget, when we close the books, those will also be in there. But it's not that we ever have a chance to save or pay more. And if the STRS rates change, we just have a different estimate for that same dual entry of equal amounts of revenue and
But
expenditure.
that's still contributing to our expenditure increase, right?
No, because it's it shows up as an expenditure increase, but we also have an exactly corresponding increase in revenue at the
Okay.
same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? I have a question on slide 11. When you talk about the carryover, can you give more specific examples of how that money's being used and when it was determined on how it was going to be used?
So with donation amounts, those dollars are released back to the school sites, and so they use that. And the best practice for them, because it often comes from PTA and it's dollars that weren't spent in the prior year, is for sites to work with their PTA and saying, hey, this is dollars that we received and we have this available to us in our account. And, the best practice is to talk with your PTA and say, how can we use this? Because it started with parent dollars. And I always say, try to spend 100% of that donation money every year because the parents gave it for their kids to be used that year. But sometimes things come in at the end of the year. It'll carry over into the next. And so those dollars are put back, and it's part of the school site's discretionary budget. That is roughly $750,000 and this year. The other really good example of carryover would be state lottery. So we could have instructional materials lottery funds that might have been budgeted for expenditures last year that did not occur. And so now we have a higher balance this year in the lottery instructional materials budget. And so that gets put back into an expenditure budget, what we didn't spend last year, and it bumps up the expenditure budget for the lottery resource.
What I'm asking is that, do we have something specific? Like, is there a textbook adoption, or is there a curriculum that we're, that we didn't spend all the money last year, so we're spending it this year, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we do have a number of adoptions going on, and we've been braiding together funds from the instructional materials block grant and also the lottery instructional materials resource. And so, the timing of those adoptions could be that, exactly what you say. We didn't make all of the expenditures last year, but we know we're going to have to make that this year. So we're building in an expenditure budget in lottery. We have the funds available because we didn't spend them last year. So this is a good example of what I mentioned earlier, where sometimes we received money last year. Now we're going to spend it this year. So it looks like we had a surplus in lottery last year. Now it looks like we have a deficit in lottery because we're spending more than we are taking in. And so you'll see those imbalances. Lottery is probably the biggest one that we have in this. We could also see some carryover amounts in special education. Our preschool, our early preschool intervention grant, that's something that's being spent year over year over year. Our educator effectiveness grant is running out, but we would obviously take any available funds to spend before the deadline runs out on educator effectiveness. And so Dr. Nye has that available to fund some additional PD this year. So that would be some of the services that we might be sending people to conferences. So it's a lot of dollars that are spread out over multiple categories that adds up to $2.6 million.
Dr. Nye?
No, I was just going to say that typically a bulk of that tends to be with instructional materials. And so science is a great example last year where it'll span over multiple years where we think we're going to adopt in a certain year. It gets pushed off to the next year. And so those funds are credited for that. So that's where we see a little bit of that happening from year to year where expenditures aren't used or they're added to a new year.
Other questions? I have others. Trustee Verbeck?
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Dill. So on the same slide, additional middle school support teachers were funded, and that came through a decision that was made by staff, I believe, sometime in August when the board was notified. I had made requests at least 2, maybe 3 times if we could add additional help for middle school, for secondary. So my question is, how did that come about? And could we find money for our high school students and teachers?
I think I'll let Dr. Nye address how that happened. I was just involved on the funding piece, but.
Yeah, I believe it was discussed in August and then approved, I believe, in September when we talked about adding some additional middle school support based on some of the data that we received back as it related to standardized test scores and the like. And so we were able to use one-time dollars again to add the 3 additional MTSS support teachers at the middle school. We'd need to go through that process again at the high school if we wanted to do that for potentially next year. We've been working with high school principals on intervention and how they're meeting the needs of students that are not meeting standards. It's a little bit more complex than just adding one teacher at the high school level versus the elementary and the middle school level where that works a little bit neater. But certainly through the LCAP process, we could have that discussion as well.
Thank you.
And Trustee Ward, you may have had a follow-up and I skipped you. I apologize, so go ahead.
No, it's okay. And I think it's pretty basic, but so when I was looking at your Exhibit A, I just want to make sure that when you're referencing the materials and services here, is that the same as the books and supplies
Yes,
line items?
yes.
Because I'm trying to match kind of the funding and it's.
Sorry, I should have said books. Well,
Okay.
to me, it's like books, materials, supplies. It's
Okay, because in books and supplies,
Yeah.
you have materials
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
supplies. So I'm just trying to figure out.
Sorry about
Okay,
that,
but
yeah.
they're the same thing?
Yes,
Okay, got
yes.
it, thank you.
Other questions? I have a few more. Okay. On slide 14. And I also want to say thank you very much for answering a lot of my questions in advance because I don't have nearly the questions I would have had otherwise. So I appreciate that. I had lots of questions. So on slide 14, you had said that, my first question is what is the statutory requirement for the state reserve for economic uncertainties?
For a district our size, it would be 3%.
3%. And you had said that the board had directed to go make it 5%?
Correct.
Could you show me where in the slide that's indicated, that amount?
So
And what
that-
that amount would be, the overage, the 2% over the statutory state requirement?
Well, it's all in this $8.8 million in the unrestricted assigned / unassigned, so the very bottom line on the first interim unrestricted column.
Okay, and then what portion, what is the 2% over the statutory amount, do you know?
You know, I'd have to do the math in my head very quickly, so.
It's about 40% of that number, would that
Let's
be
go-
accurate?
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it's 40% of that number.
So 40% of that number.
2/5 of that number.
Okay, great, two-fifths of that number, okay. And then as far as under commitments, we have, I think we could still call it a stabilization fund.
Correct.
Where in that,
So that's
where
right
in that
above
line
that.
item, and
Yeah.
how much is for the stabilization fund in the commitments?
If I can be precise, $3,124,000 and some change.
Okay, very good. And that's part of the
3.124 million.
committed aspect, correct? Okay. Okay, and thank you again for answering my other questions. And assuring that we won't be having that health and welfare benefit happen again.
Yes,
I appreciate
absolutely,
that.
Yes.
Are there other questions? No other questions? May I have a motion to approve the submission of the first interim financial report as of October 31, 2024, Exhibit A?
A motion to approve?
I have a motion from trustee Emery. May I have a second?
I'll second.
A second from trustee Sayosi. And discussion. I have some discussion that I'd like to try to get a consensus from the board on. And it was part of my questions that I had recently asked, but if you look at the actual report, the financial report for the first interim, and if you look at page 13, I don't know, is that something that we can be brought up, or
Sure.
should we just do it here?
Sure.
Or okay. And I did have this conversation. They understood what my request was going to be, so I just wanted to. As we discussed, I got to make mine bigger here. There we go. Okay. So as we just discussed.
Trustee Rawlings, am I on the
yes.
correct page here?
It should be page 13. Is that better?
Okay.
No, I think it's further down. It should be the, it should have committed stabilization
Okay, I'm
arrangements,
sorry. It's
object
the-
code
I-
9750.
It's the cover page was throwing me. Okay, all right. Correct.
I don't think that's it. It's one more down,
This is
I
page
think?
13, it says page 13 of 122.
Okay, maybe. I apologize, it's page 14.
Okay.
Committed stabilization arrangements?
Yes, it's page 13 of, you were on the right.
Okay.
13 of 122. 14 of the slide.
No, that's.
Oh, you know, okay,
one
I
more.
think I know where you're going. Hang on. Let me
It's
just,
at the top.
let's see. If I, page 20. Sorry.
I'm looking at object code. Let me see here. If that helps. Object code 9750.
I'm sorry, I was going by page 13 of the PDF document.
Right, and it's this, right.
Okay.
But if you're looking at the slides, it's page 14. And it's at the top.
Okay, oh, okay.
That doesn't look like it either. That looks like it. There it is.
Okay,
Okay, very
okay.
good. Okay, very good.
Gotcha,
Thank you.
Gotcha, okay, thank you, sorry about that.
So as part of my questions that I had asked Mr. Dill, many years ago, the board gave direction to have a stabilization arrangement under object code 9750. These dollars have been set aside for at least 9 years that I'm aware of, and they've never been used for the purpose that they've been set aside for. As well as if you look at object code 9789, which he had just referred to in the slide, and it's now approximately $8,732,461. The state only requires that the board set aside 3% for economic uncertainties, and the former board had directed staff to set aside 5%. So approximately 40% of those dollars are above and beyond and were directed by a previous board. So what I would like to recommend is that we take the stabilization arrangement and we put 40% or what is equal to 2% over the state requirement, and that we collapse that into one object code that states board LCAP priorities, which my math shows a little over $7 million would be placed in that LCAP into the board LCAP priorities portion of the budget. So it doesn't really change the budget. It just reprioritizes how we as a board decide that we want to spend those dollars. And to address what you were talking about, Trustee Verbeth, I think that would be a way, as they were saying, that if we want additional teachers, that we need to move the money around in order to prioritize what you were talking about as far as additional teachers at the high school or whatever the board decides to. So I want to see if I can get consensus to ask to direct staff, as had been done in the past, to take those two areas and collapse them into a LCAP, a board LCAP priorities fund. Trustee Emery.
Can staff explain what the stabilization was previously designed for and what, if any, implications there might be in doing so?
Yes, can you do that?
Sure.
Mr. Duff?
So this was set up, I think, back in 2015, I think it was, when the district was moving in and out of basic aid, or they foresaw that. And when you go into basic aid, there are a couple of risks that you have. One is if you have a sudden growth in enrollment, that doesn't come with growth in revenue because you're relying on the property tax base. And so boards, and I've been in 2 other basic aid districts, sometimes they will set aside dollars to say, if we need to hire more teachers, but we don't have the additional property tax revenue to do it, we have set aside dollars in our ending balance to handle that extra unforeseen expense that came with having more kids without more property tax revenue. That would be one. Another issue that happens in your first 2 years of basic aid, in year 2, which would be next year, there will be a transfer of property tax dollars to state authorized charters that are educating our students. So, and so they get a piece of what otherwise would be their LCFF. And so that would be a loss of property tax revenue for us in year 2. And you know, what you hope is that your tax growth is enough to cover that loss. And then in the second year after you become basic aid, you lose what is called supplemental revenue, supplemental tax revenue. That's revenue that when properties turn over, they were assessed at this value. The new owner comes in, they pay a supplemental tax bill on the new value of the house. And for some reason, and I've never looked into it, basic aid districts don't qualify to get that extra revenue. It shows up on the permanent tax roll the following year, but the first year, the new owner pays that half of a year on a higher assessed value property. We don't get that for some reason. That's about $2 million a year in our budget right now. That in 2 years will no longer be a property tax source that we will receive. So again, you know, the district would hope that that our property tax growth grows enough to cover the lot, and the secured roll grows enough to cover that loss of revenue that we would receive. But if for some reason it didn't, these dollars would be there to fill that hole and smooth out that peak and valley. This is why I say in year 3 of being basic aid, that's when it starts to get fun, because now you've got your new base of your revenue. And then it just starts growing year over year over year, and you don't have those other hits of where you actually have some losses. Those happen in year 1 and year 2, following your first year. This is actually year 0 for us. Next year would be year 1, the following year would be year 2. Yes.
And I just wondered if that was necessary, that could be used for that purpose, correct?
Well, it depends on the size of the loss of property tax revenue. It would come out of the reserves if we had a surplus the following years.
We're still in discussion, but if we want to ask additional questions.
Certainty of having reserves, in terms of if you, and I can explain the difference between commitments and assignments, unassigned, unappropriated, up to committed, and we changed the name of stabilization. Desires to sustain levels of staffing or types of programs, priorities, and say, staff, we direct you to use this reserve to sustain this program. There to cover any shortfall of revenue for programs that we didn't want to jeopardize. So you could change the value of that. The difference between a commitment and an assignment, a commitment is something that the board directs staff and says, set dollars aside for this. And we can't use it for other purposes without you saying either it's okay to draw down on those dollars. On assignments, that is where staff can say, hey, we want to set dollars aside for this. And we can make decisions, of course, ultimately bringing the budget for approval. There's more flexibility in assignments, but we could.
So then the staff could make an assignment for secondary at the high school level like you did in August, because the board didn't approve that. So the staff made that approval, right? Is that correct? So you could do that again. We could keep it as is, seeing that we haven't entered basic aid yet, and we don't really know how, we're not stable in basic aid yet. Would you recommend that we stay the course right now and leave things as is, because there are so many moving parts at this point?
What I would say is really the ending balance, if you think about it, has no real bearing on this year. Really, it has a bearing on how we use these dollars for next year, because these are the dollars that we have not put it, that are available. They're in the bank account, but they're not in our monthly budget of expenditures, if that makes sense of how to think of this is the savings account. So we have not made any obligations on all of those dollars in the ending balance, and we would expect them, if we were to shut the doors today, we would expect to have this many dollars in the bank account at the end of the year that we could use for next year for whatever purpose. So I would say that for purposes of this budget and what we're talking about this evening, it really makes no difference, because we're not talking about this year's expenditures if we're talking about committing next year's ending balance. Where this would come into play is as we're developing the budget and we're bringing it forward and we're saying, here's our estimate on revenue in, here's our estimate on expenditures out, here is what is left over. And if the board would like to call every dollar in the ending balance something, we can give names to those dollars that are in the ending balance. If you want to commit them, you can commit them. If you want to just say, no, just throw it all in the unassigned and, and be free with it, those are board decisions that they could direct us to do. And so that would then, particularly if we do have a shortfall for next year in the budget development process, you could say, well, we know that we've got these dollars in the budget stabilization account. Please use these dollars to sustain this program. And we could do that. So it really is a decision for this upcoming year, and not so much of how we're going to call this in this current year. But we could certainly do this exercise of, if we were to just shift those dollars up into that, work on that for second interim, and maybe through some updates, we can say, I could mock it up of this is what it would look like. And if that's what we would like to put in second interim, we could put it in second interim. We could have it at estimated actuals. We could have it in the adopted budget. I mean, we would have that flexibility to do that. But it really makes no difference in terms of tonight's budget what we do, because really we're talking about the expenditures and the revenue tonight.
Other discussion? I would just like to say, as long as I've been on the board, and that's been 9 years, we have not used that stabilization fund at all, and we've gone in and out of basic aid. And the economic uncertainties, we have definitely gone through some uncertainties over the last several years, and the previous board would not utilize those dollars for those uncertainties, which I personally think that there could have been. I mean, I've talked about this for many, many years, so this isn't a new concept for me, as far as I believe this money should be used in the classroom and not just sitting in a bank account. For a just in case, because, you know, we've been talking about just in case for the last 9 years, and there have been, in my opinion, there have been areas where we could have used these dollars that could have been better used, in my opinion, for our students. And so that's the reason why I'm bringing it up now, because we are in first interim, and that by the time we get to second interim, we're in the spring, and we're talking about our priorities for LCAP. And as we've talked, Trustee Verbeff, about, you know, some additional priorities for interventions or for other things that we as a board want to determine that we do with these dollars. And again, a previous board directed these dollars in one direction, and what I'm suggesting is that this board direct them in another way. Trustee Ward.
I wonder if, I know Mr. Dill offered to do a mock-up of what that would look like. Is that something that he could do when he?
Well, the problem is that it would be, that if we say that this is where we want the dollars to be committed, we could just direct staff to do that, and then the budget would remain the same. It would just be called something different, and those dollars would be there. But I guess from my perspective, what I'm asking for consensus for is that the board directs staff to do that, and then when we are in LCAP discussions, we have the option to maybe tap into those dollars if we choose to. So that's why I want to make sure that we do it now, so then at LCAP time that we have that opportunity.
So then what I'm hearing you say is for the stabilization arrangement monies, then we would be renaming that as an LCAP.
Board LCAP priorities.
Board LCAP priorities.
And we would also take the additional 2% above state requirements
And
under.
stick it in there as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, so that's my request of the board.
And what I'm also hearing Mr. Dill say is, regardless of what it's called, not the uncertainty funds, but
Right.
the stabilization, we can utilize that however we'd like. So the difference would be the change of the name and the additional cost from the additional 2%. Correct?
Right.
Okay.
However, as Mr. Dill said, that if things are looking uncertain and that we're concerned
We can
about
move it
programs or
back.
whatever, well, we could say that
Take the
our
money.
priority is, as a board, our priority is this. And so it still matches with the
Yeah.
intent of those dollars. It's just the board directs those dollars in more of a practical and functional way, instead of them sitting in a reserve. So it's more, in my view, it's more flexible for the board. Trustee Sayosi, you look like you have something as far as
do.
discussion?
Yes, well, I'm kind of chewing on Mr. Dill's comment about us being on year zero, and I'm wondering if this might be a really wise decision to be done a year or two from now, when we've ridden this wave and we're in a different time.
Thank you for that. Is there any other discussion? Trustee Verbeff.
Yes, so the previous boards over the last 9 years have had some pretty sharp people who have studied numbers, who I've known personally, who I think were very qualified in looking at, our budget. And with the uncertainty, I'm just not comfortable yet. I would rather wait. We're not even in basic aid yet. That won't be till the end of this year. So I'd like to ride this wave, like Trustee COC is commenting on, and wait it out a little bit. So I will not be in favor of this.
Thank you. Trustee Ward?
I just wanted to respond to Trustee COC that I think that's a valid point. However, I do want to just remind us of the fact that we could also go back into those funds. So if we did need those monies, we can direct staff to pull them out again. Does that make sense? So it's essentially just moving the money, and not that we can't access it, but it gives us the opportunity to fund things like the intervention program at the secondary level and things like that, so we have it available to us and for students.
So any other discussion? Okay, so can I see thumbs for those in favor? Okay, there's 3 thumbs. If you could make that happen, I'd appreciate that. And any other discussion? Okay, then Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
No.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
No.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 3-2.
Thank you. And we'll now move on to item 8.2, resolution number 18-2425, adoption of the annual and 5-year reportable fees report for fiscal year 23-24 in compliance with Government Code Sections 66006 and 66001, developer fees. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mr. Eric Dill.
Thank you. This is an annual routine item where we deliver a report to the board showing the amount of developer fees we collected, the amount that we expended out of those funds, and then potential uses for those, which are all detailed in the report. And so we ask that the board approve the resolution and that accepts the report.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any questions? No questions. I may have a motion to approve resolution number 182425, adoption of the annual 5-year reportable fees report for fiscal year 23-24 in compliance with Government Code Section 66006 and 66001, developer fees, Exhibit A.
So moved. I'll second.
Motion by Trustee Verbath, second by Trustee Sayosi. Is there any discussion? No discussion. Trustees Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to item 8.3, approval CUSD LIUNA tentative agreement. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mrs. Megan Arias.
Thank you. The district and LIUNA bargaining teams have held negotiation sessions throughout the year, and a tentative agreement was reached and signed by the parties on November 25th, 2024. The agreement was then ratified by LIUNA members on December 11th, 2024. The tentative agreement states that unit members will be provided a 4.5% on-schedule salary increase effective July 1st, 2024 for classified staff who are employed on the first day of the month following ratification by the board, and a 1.5% one-time bonus of the annual salary based on the employee's annual salary on the newly adopted salary schedule. The 1.5% one-time bonus will be based on a full year of the contracted annual salary in their current position, regardless of the employee's start date. It is respectfully recommended that the Board of Trustees approve the CUSD LIUNA tentative agreement dated November 25th, 2024, Exhibit A, the accompanying AB 1200-2756 financial disclosure, which certifies that the district can meet its financial obligations under the proposed agreement in the current year as well as 2 years out, Exhibit B, and the accompanying salary schedule, Exhibit C. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
With no blue cards, trustees, do you have any questions? No questions. May I have a motion to approve the CUSD LIUNA tentative agreement dated November 25, 2024, Exhibit A, the accompanying AB 1200-2756 financial disclosure, Exhibit B, and the accompanying salary schedule, Exhibit C.
So moved.
Second.
Trustee Ward moved. Trustee Verbath second. Any discussion? No discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbev?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to item 8.4, request for proposal to conduct superintendent search. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mrs. Megan Arias.
Thank you. On October 10th, 2024, former Superintendent Ben Churchill informed the board that he would be resigning effective December 1st, 2024. In order to conduct a comprehensive search for the district's next superintendent, it is appropriate for the board to enlist the services of a professional consultant or executive firm to facilitate the process. By enlisting the services of an outside entity, the board will be able to cast a wide net for qualified candidates and remain competitive during this highly specialized recruitment and selection process. It is recommended that the Board of Trustees approve the request for proposals to engage the services of a professional consulting firm to assist the board with the search and selection of a new superintendent, Exhibit A. It is further recommended that the board appoint an ad hoc subcommittee to conduct reference checks to be reviewed by the full board when determining finalists to invite for a final interview. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
With no blue cards, trustees, do you have any questions?
I do.
Trustee Verbev?
So I'm brand new to all this. I think a few of us are. If we get some names, if some names are thrown into the pot, let's say, that are people who are already available, do you have to go through a search firm if you end up with somebody who's qualified, we interview and we like? How does this work?
Well, the first decision would be, do you want to use an executive search firm to conduct the whole recruitment and selection process, or do you want to handle it just in-house? Either way, if there's candidates that are interested, and if there is an executive search firm used, we would funnel those candidates through to the executive search firm that they're interested. Otherwise, if it's in-house, we'd be recruiting and collecting names as well.
Is that a follow-up?
Yeah.
Trustee
Well,
Verbev?
is it appropriate to ask about what's the average cost of these search firms?
So they'll vary from firm to firm. What I can say is that historically we have used consultants and firms in this district, so costs are going to vary. But when we used them in the past to replace Dr. Lovely with Dr. Churchill, it cost $25,000, and that was in 2016. And then to replace, before that, to replace Dr. Roach with Dr. Lovely, they had hired 2 independent consultants. They spent about $15,000, and that was in 2012. So I would anticipate anything from about 25 to 30, or it could be a little bit more. Again, it will depend on the firms. If we go with the search firm, they will include all those costs in their submission when we do a request for proposals.
Other questions or follow-ups? May I have a motion to approve the request for a proposal to engage the services of a professional consultant firm to assist the board with the search and selection of a new superintendent, Exhibit A? It is further recommended that the board appoint an ad hoc subcommittee to conduct reference checks to be reviewed by the full board when determining finalists to invite for an interview.
Motion?
Second?
We have a motion by Trustee Ward, a second by Trustee Verbev. Do we have discussion? I do have discussion as well. I thought the same thing. I was thinking like, gosh, if we just have 10 candidates, why do we need a search firm and all that? And I do believe with an interim superintendent that's not full-time, and then with Mr. Dill also leaving, I think it would be an overload for our staff. So that from my perspective, that's when I kind of said, I'm not going to ask that question. So that was something that I was, just to kind of address what you were saying as well. Trustee Emery?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, along that same lines, coming from another district that has also hired numerous superintendents, I have to say, I think we've very well exhausted a lot of the ones we have in the area. And, I think expanding it would only provide us the higher quality of expectation that we strive for here in Carlsbad.
And along those lines, I think it keeps it more objective as well. I think if you have candidates that you want to recommend to the search firm, they can at least, make sure that they have all the correct qualifications, but that makes it less like all of Gretchen's people or all of, Kathy's people or my peer, or whatever, it keeps it more objective and having somebody that's outside of all of us to do it.
Other discussion? I did have, I had something that I wanted to change on the RFP and see if I can get consensus from the board as well. On the RFP itself, on the first bullet says background and experience with superintendent searches throughout the region and state. I wanted to include national as well. And so I'd like to see that added to that one bullet. So if I can have thumbs on that. Okay, great. Okay, so if we can make that change. That was my only thing on here. I wanted to, we did find Dr. Churchill on a national search. And so I do think that it is, it's worth finding somebody that has experience in a national search. So that was the only thing I had for discussion on that aspect. Are there any other discussion on the RFP? Okay, and then we're also looking at, staff has requested that we look at an ad hoc committee to review and kind of paper screen a little bit for the full board would be making all the decisions. It would just be an ad hoc committee to, kind of deal with some of the, I guess some of the additional work that staff would be doing and give input based on the board. Could you explain that more, what you're asking for?
Sure. So the thought was, the RFP deadline would be around probably January 8th. We'd post it and have a deadline. After January 8th, this subcommittee, composed of 2 board members, would go through, they can go through the RFPs, but they would go through and check references. So every RFP is asking for districts that have used them in the past. They do a few reference checks, and then they can bring that information back to the January 15th special board meeting, where the board will be reviewing all of the RFP submissions. They could hear those reference check results and then narrow down the top finalists. That would then be invited to the January 22nd meeting, where that would be the interview of the top finalists. They would give like a 10-minute presentation. We allow 10 minutes of questions. And then at that January 22nd meeting, a selection would be made and a contract approved. So it's kind of getting some of that reference check work done ahead of time so that there's more information being brought to the final decision when the board is reviewing that.
And that was my understanding, but to just be clear that, my understanding also is that this ad hoc committee is just for the search firm. This is not for the superintendent, the applicants for the superintendent. This is only applicants for the search firm. So I just wanted to, that was my understanding of it, and I wanted to make sure that that was what we were talking about. So, so I would like to volunteer to be on that committee, just because I have had experience in hiring a superintendent. And Trustee Ward. Okay. Any objections? Okay. So I think we have a ad hoc committee. And we have all the information we need on the RFP. We've made some changes. Are there any additional discussion on this piece? Okay. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee Cioce?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. And next one is item 8.5, revision of board policies, first reading. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Dr. Nye.
Thank you, President Rawlings, trustees, and Superintendent Schmidt. This is an update to Board Policy 5121.9, specifically around academic honesty. This is a first reading of the policy revision. Staff's recommending, per past practice, that we bring this back in January for a second bite at the apple. And traditionally, that's what we like to do with our board policies. You get a first reading, an opportunity to provide some feedback, and then we'll bring it back for a second reading for final approval. We've updated the policy to align to the most recent California School Board Association language. We do this, align it to the language for a couple different reasons. CSBA vets this with their attorneys for all relevant ed code provisions as well as recent legislation. And the more that we're aligned with the CSBA language, it allows us for updates to be easily incorporated. Sometimes you'll see board policies come back 2, maybe 3 times a year. When you're adopting CSBA language, it's easier to track those changes and incorporate those into the next board policy revision. So what you have before you tonight is 2 exhibits. Exhibit A is really our current language that's highlighted in white. Below that is the updated CSBA language, which is highlighted in green, I believe. And then Exhibit B is really just a clean copy of what that policy would look like with our language incorporated with the new language. Basically, the new language is centered around academic honesty, and it talks about the use of permitted and unpermitted technology use. So as you can imagine, technology use has changed quite a bit in the last few years, so it's incorporating some language around student use, AI, and appropriateness and inappropriateness of student use for that. So staff will turn it back over to President Rawlings. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. This is time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any questions? I do, Dr. Knight. You had mentioned that traditionally we would do a first reading and then bring it back for a second reading. Would you be opposed if there was just a small change that the trustees agreed to bypass the second reading? Would there be any opposition to that?
Staff's not opposed to that. I just wanted to be considerate of the new trustees as far as the idea that this is the first time they're seeing this information and potentially bringing that back for a second reading. But I'm not opposed to just adopting CSBA language. We can always agendize it for another time if there's any updates we want to do at a later date.
Thank you. Any other questions? No questions. May I have a motion to approve Board Policy 5131.9 and approve as a first reading?
Yes, I motion. However, there is a slight, I believe, spelling error in there, but other than that, yes.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Yes.
Second. I hear a second from Trustee Ward. So motion from Trustee Emery, second from Trustee Ward. Discussion. Trustee Verba.
Thank you for making these modifications. I just wanted to let our newest trustees know why this was brought before us this evening is because we have a strategic plan that's involving information and technology in our school district, and I felt that this was important for us to discuss before we approve that plan. So I wanted you to know why it hadn't been updated since 2006, and I figured, wow, I think technology has changed quite a bit since 2006, so I think it would be appropriate to make sure we look at this first before we approve a plan involving technology. So I just wanted you to have the backstory on that. So thank you.
And I also I was wanting to do a small change. It would be the very last sentence that states, and or makeup work or other uses approved by the teacher. I wanted it to say by the teacher of record. And I've seen it's happened in the past that somebody's on a teacher's roster, but then they're provided makeup work by another teacher, let's say, and it's being assigned through like an AI program called like Ingenuity or other pieces. And then the teacher of record is having to take responsibility for, whether it was appropriate use of technology or not. But they did not make the assignment themselves. So I just wanted a small change where it says it's the teacher of record that is the one who determines whether the policy is being used. So I wanted to see if I can get consensus for that minor change. I see 3 thumbs at least. Okay, 5 thumbs. So if we could do that, and then with that change, I want to ask if the maker of the motion would be willing to amend their motion to make that change and also bypass the second reading. Would you be willing to amend your motion?
Yes, I will amend the motion to include the teacher of record in that last paragraph, and then also to bypass the second reading.
Excellent. And the second approves of that as well?
Yes.
Okay, so we have trustee Emery has amended her motion, and trustee Ward has seconded that amendment. And with any further discussion, Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to item 8.6, resolution number 202425, authorizing a preliminary guaranteed maximum price, execution, and delivery of a site lease, sublease, construction services agreement, and other acts relating to the district's Aviara Oaks Middle School modernization project. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mr. Eric Dill.
Thank you. Back in September, we presented a design concept for Aviara Oaks Middle School. That was given the green light, and so we've developed construction documents. We're currently in the Division of State Architect waiting for approval. We actually are we have moved teachers out of the the portable classrooms that will be replaced by this project. And will be conducting demolition over winter break of those. That's being done because we do expect to get approval back from DSA, Division of State Architect, in the early spring, and our hope is that we can get going during spring break to get a couple of extra months head start on this project. So this is the preliminary guaranteed maximum price with Lou Sardi. As soon as we have the plans approved from DSA, then we will go back and do a rebid of the project, incorporating any of the changes that they might have made. We don't expect really any, but there's always a chance that DSA might require something different. We'll do the final bids on that, and we're also looking at other ways that we can do some value engineering and bring down the overall cost of the project at the same time. And then we will bring back to you the final guaranteed maximum price. But by approving this, it allows Lou Sardi to work directly with the architect and in working with the plans to ensure we have full constructability of them. And then also that gives them access to the school site so that they can also do some other work that they need to do to make sure that when they come back with the final guaranteed maximum price, that is the not to exceed amount. So this helps us get there, and the board will have one more time to look at this when it becomes the final guaranteed maximum price. So we kindly request that the board approve this resolution.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any questions? Nope. Trustee Verbath.
So Mr. Dill is leaving us, so will we be talking to Jessica? What is the chain of command for questions?
Well, we'll have to determine how that will happen. We are working on an interim assistant superintendent of business who will be sitting in this seat and would be the same conduit that you would have, working directly with Ms. Kimbrell, who's doing a fantastic job for us. Yeah.
I'd like to add one
Go ahead.
other point on that, and I will update the board, but likely we'll schedule something in the January 22nd board meeting to let you know where we are with the interim replacement and also to begin to move forward on a permanent CBO replacement.
Any additional questions? May I have a motion to approve resolution number 202425, authorizing a preliminary guaranteed maximum price, execution and delivery of a site lease, sublease, construction services agreement, and other acts relating to the district's Aviara Oaks Middle School modernization project, Exhibit A.
So moved.
I'll second.
Trustee Verbath moved and trustee COC second. Any discussion? Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to item 8.7, 2025 CSB Delegate Assembly Candidate Nomination. Trustees, this is a discussion action item. I will now hand it over to Mr. Rick Schmidt.
Thank you, President Rawlings. It is respectfully recommended that the Board of Trustees nominate Trustee Michelle Sudagawa Ward to serve as a candidate on the 2025 California School Board Association, otherwise known as CSBA Delegate Assembly. The CSBA Delegate Assembly sets the general policy direction for the association, which represents California school districts and county offices of education. Delegates fulfill a critical governance role by communicating the interest of local boards to CSBA's Board of Directors, Executive Committee, and staff. They provide policy and legislative direction to the adoption of the policy platform every 2 years and the adoption of other policy statements as needed.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Have any blue cards been received?
We do not have any blue cards.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any questions? I do, Trustee Ward. I just want to make sure you're willing to serve on this as a delegate, so long as you're elected.
Well, I have some extra time. So I think it would be a good time to do it.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? No questions? May I have a motion to nominate Trustee Ward to serve as a candidate on the 2025 California School Boards Association CSBA Delegate Assembly?
So moved.
And second?
Trustee Sayosi moved. Trustee Emery second. Any discussion? All I have to say is that Claudine Jones was a delegate for many years and she was on the Carlsbad board, and I felt it was a great opportunity. We were able to get lots of information here locally at our board, and we were able to give information to CSBA as well, so I felt that we were well represented, and I'm confident that Trustee Ward would do the same. So this is just the first step, so we would also need to, they'll be voting, I believe, in February. Do you remember the time frame?
That sounds right. I'm not positive.
Okay, there's some paperwork, so this would just be a nomination, and there could be competition as far as other board members throughout the region, because this is this is all of San Diego. So my hope is that we can not only nominate Trustee Ward, but also get her to the finish line and get her to be a delegate. So I just wanted to throw that out there as discussion and support. So,
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Because I think Trustee Ward would be fantastic. It'd be great to have a delegate here in Carlsbad again as well, and I think you'd be a great addition to that. Did you want to say anything?
No, just thank you, and I will do the best I can and make sure that we're very well informed. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Any other discussion? No other discussion? Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you. We now move on to Part 9, Communications, Item 9.1, Governance Team Reports. This is the time for trustees to provide a brief report if they've attended committee meetings where they represented the district. Are there any governance team reports? With none there, then we also move on to item 9.2, trustee requests for information from staff. Trustees, are there any requests for information from staff that have already been discussed with the superintendent and have been recommended to bring to the board? Trustee Ward.
Yes, I do have a request. I want to see if the staff can bring back some information in regard to term limits and I'm looking at, and this would probably be under discussion later, but as a 3-term for all of so it would start with the next election, so it's not knocking anybody out here. That's a sitting board member, but with new elections that are coming forth, it would be 3 terms after that. So having some language around that and seeing how we can make that an agenda item.
And I forgot to add, I just want to say, as a reminder, trustees are prohibited from having a discussion tonight on this item per the Brown Act. And so when you've made your request, you said that you talked to staff, or I'm assuming you talked to staff and that already about it? Yes, okay. And that, okay. And so we can't have any discussion, so we're just looking at for information. So do we have thumbs for that request for information? Okay, looks like we have thumbs for that. Excellent. Any other requests for information from staff? Okay.
No, I do.
Okay, I think, wait, do you have another one? It's on, is it on 9.3?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. We move to item 9.3, trustee requests for future agenda items. Trustees, are there any requests for future agenda items that have already been discussed with the superintendent and have been recommended to bring to the board? And I'm going to say the reminder, as a reminder, trustees are prohibited from having a discussion tonight as these items per the Brown Act. When making a request, please indicate the purpose of the request and whether or not staff has provided an estimate of how long the request will take to accomplish. Trustee Ward, did you say you had? Okay, go ahead.
For the next agenda, I'm looking at having 2 full-day kinder sites as a pilot, preferably one on the north end of the district and one on the south end of the district. And I would leave it to staff to decide on the site for that. I'd like to have that on the agenda.
And just to clarify, you're asking for that to be on the January agenda?
Correct.
Okay. And so do we have consensus for that? Okay, we have 5 thumbs for that. And do you have all that information?
A clarifying question as a information discussion item. Okay.
Okay, any other agenda item requests? No? Okay, it is 8:16 and the regular meeting is now adjourned. Our next regular meeting will take place on January 22nd, 2025 at 6 p.m. at the Carlsbad Unified School District office.
And we have one more meeting, trustee Rawlings.
I apologize, hang on.
We do.
Well, we adjourned the regular meeting, sorry. Trustees, we now move on to the Part 13, Education Facilities Corporation meeting. I apologize. Okay. Okay, so the Carlsbad Unified Board of Trustees has concluded their regular meeting. I will now call to order the annual meeting of the Carlsbad Unified School District Educational Facilities Corporation. This is the time and place designated for the meeting. Ms. Garcia, have we received any blue cards regarding the Educational Facilities Corporation meeting, inclusive of items 12.1 through 12.6?
We do not have any blue cards.
Thank you. After all hang on. I now turn it to Mr. Dill, Assistant Superintendent, Business Services.
Thank you for staying for this bonus meeting. The purpose of the Educational Facilities Corporation is basically to be an intermediary in certain financing transactions that we do, such as our certificates of participation. The officers of the corporation mirror the officers of the Board of Trustees, so that we will ask Trustee Rawlings to walk through the item which appoints the officers that you elected earlier this evening into the same roles for the corporation.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any questions for staff? I move that the Board of Trustees of the Carlsbad Unified School District and each board member individually hereby accept the position of Board of Directors of the Carlsbad Unified School District Educational Facilities Corporation effective as of December 18th, 2024, serving in the same capacity as voted upon earlier, with the exception of the board clerk, who will serve as the treasurer to the corporation. That would be President Rawlings, Vice President Ward, Treasurer, Clerk, Trustee Verbath. Terry, may I have a second?
Second.
Board discussion. Ms. Garcia, please call for a vote.
Trustee COC?
Yes.
Trustee Emery?
Yes.
Trustee Ward?
Yes.
Trustee Verbath?
Yes.
Trustee Rawlings?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
The next meeting date of the Carlsbad Unified School District Educational Facilities Corporation is scheduled for December 10th, 2025, following the adjournment of the organizational meeting of the Board of Trustees. I now declare the annual meeting of the Carlsbad School District Educational Facilities Corporation is now adjourned. There we go. So finish that out, okay. All right.